Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to share with you the picture or pictures that are famously associated with them. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please put hot dog water ice cubes in the like button's lemonade. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. At 7:27 p.m. on February 9th, 2004, a woman called the Grafton County Sheriff's Department to report a car accident. A small black sedan appeared to be wedged up against a snowbank off the side of the highway near this woman's house in Woodsville, New Hampshire. The sheriff thanked her for calling and dispatched officers to check it out. 16 minutes later, at 7:43 p.m., the sheriff's department gets another call about this black sedan up against the snowbank, and it came in from a local school bus driver. The driver said he was going down the road and he sees this black sedan up against the side of the road, and what appeared to be the driver, this young woman, no one was helping her. So the school bus driver pulls over and walks up to her. She says her name is Maura Murray. She's 21 years old. She's a college student in Massachusetts. She seemed totally fine, but was adamant that he did not call the police. And so the school bus driver at the time didn't call the police. He kind of sized her up as seeming like she was okay. She said she was going to call for a tow truck. And so he left thinking she was going to be just fine. But only a couple of minutes after leaving the scene, he felt like, you know what, I got to call the police because something just seemed off. The sheriff tells him that they had already gotten a call about 20 minutes earlier and that officers would be there any minute, and I'm sure she's just fine. 3 minutes later, the officer who was originally dispatched to check out this black sedan shows up and radios in and says, the black sedan is here, but there's no girl, there's no driver. Police do an initial search of the area. They can't find Maura. There's no sign of where she would have gone. There's no sign of a struggle. They get in touch with Maura's family. They can't get in touch with Maura. And so it's like she just kind of vanished. And so that night, they labeled Maura officially a missing person. On February 8th, the day before Maura went missing, she was with her father. They went out to eat, and he would say to police that she seemed totally normal. There was no red flags. There was no clear stressors in her life. Everything just seemed normal. The next morning when she gets up on February 9th, this is the day she goes missing, she finds out that all of her classes that day have been canceled because of a snowstorm. She gets up, goes over to her computer, and emails all of her professors as well as her work supervisor and tells them that there's been a death in her family and she needs to take the next week off. Family members would say that there was no death in the family, that was a lie. After emailing her professors, she drives to an ATM, withdraws $280, and then goes to a liquor store and buys $40 worth of alcohol. She also stopped at the Amherst DMV to get some paperwork she needed for some damage that had been done to her car. After that, we don't really know what she was doing until she wound up on that snowbank in Woodsville, New Hampshire. When police searched her abandoned car, they found printed out directions to a condo complex in Burlington, Vermont. Cell phone records show Maura had placed a call to one of the owners of a condo that had been put up for rent, but Maura had not indicated to anyone in her life that she was looking to rent a condo in Burlington, Vermont. Nor had she indicated to anyone that she might be traveling to Vermont for any reason. When they searched her dorm room, all of her belongings had been packed and her room had been meticulously cleaned. It was clear that she was getting ready to leave her dorm, but this is mid-semester. There's no reason she'd be leaving prematurely. And on top of her belongings in her dorm room was this typed up note to her boyfriend detailing all of their relationship issues. It wasn't a breakup note, but it was definitely something close to that. Most of Maura's belongings were either in her dorm room, all packed up, or in her abandoned car. But her cell phone, debit cards, and credit cards were all missing. However, they were never used again after the day she went missing, February 9th. 6 days after Maura went missing, a massive search is conducted around her abandoned car. They covered 20 square miles. They had helicopters. They had sent sniffing dogs. They had hundreds of people on the ground, and there was just no trace of her. But even more strangely, on the night Maura went missing, there was snow on the ground. So you'd think you'd be able to find a couple footprints showing you where Maura might have gone. But there was none. And the scent-sniffing dogs could only track her scent about 100 feet away from the car before they lost the scent. It was like she vanished into thin air. So something happened to Maura Murray between 7:46 p.m. when the bus driver left the scene and called the police. He said she was there, he saw her, and 7:49 p.m. when the officer who was dispatched arrived on scene, and more is not there. She went somewhere, we just don't know where or why or with who. And unfortunately, to this day, this case remains unsolved. Here is the final picture of Maura Murray. This is her withdrawing $280 at that ATM shortly before she hopped back in her car, drove up to Woodsville, New Hampshire, crashed on the side of the road, and then disappeared. Armin Meiwes seemed like a really good guy. He mowed his neighbor's lawn, he offered to fix his friends' cars, he would host these great dinner parties at his house. But underneath that charming outer layer, Armin Meiwes was a deeply disturbed individual. In 2001, Armin would place an ad on the internet seeking a young, well-built man that is looking to be slaughtered and then consumed. Meiwes actually got a lot of replies to this, and people acted like they were interested, but I think people were just responding because it was such an outrageous thing he was asking for, so no one went through with it. Until a man named Bernard Brandis saw it, who had previously placed an ad on the internet himself, asking if there was anybody out there that would slaughter and eat him. So perfect match. So Brandis reaches out to Armin and says, yes, I'd love to. And on March 9th, 2001, the two meet up at Armin's house. Brandis lays down in the bathtub while Armin sets up a video camera. He wants to film this for a variety of reasons, but mostly he wants to make sure that everybody sees that Brandis is doing this willingly. On camera, Brandis gives Armin the go-ahead. Initially, Armin tries biting into Brandis, but apparently he was too chewy, so Brandis suggests he gets a knife. After successfully removing a piece of Brandis, Armin fries it up in a pan, and the two of them begin to eat it. But apparently it was too burned to either of their liking, and they would feed that piece of him to the dog. At this point, Brandis is in and out of consciousness because he's losing a lot of blood, so Armin decides to take a break and go to his room and read a Star Trek book. When Armin goes back in the bathroom, it's clear that Brandis is still alive, but he's on the verge of death. So after much deliberation and quite a bit of praying, Armin ultimately ends Brandis's life and then proceeds to butcher him and put all of his meat into a freezer. Over the next 10 months, Armin would consume over 44 pounds of Brandis. In December of 2001, Armin put another ad online seeking somebody else that wanted to be eaten, and that ad would get sent to the police, who would go to Armin's house. They would find Brandis's remains behind pizza boxes in the back of his freezer, and they would arrest Armin. Despite showing police the videotape that showed Brandis repeatedly consenting to what was happening to him, Armin was still given a life sentence. This is the picture that Brandis put online in hopes that it would attract someone that would want to eat him. And this is the bathtub where Armin Meiwes would grant Brandis that wish. A disaster began to quietly unfold at 8:49 a.m. on April 16, 2014. The Seawall ferry that was on a routine trip to Jeju Island in South Korea was beginning to lean very badly to one side. The ferry had recently undergone illegal renovations, adding a whole bunch of new rooms to the top of the ferry that made it much more profitable, but dangerously top-heavy. Corrupt regulators who were bought off with fancy dinners and travel allowed the ship to sail unsafe despite never having stepped foot on board. Had they gone on the ship themselves, they would have seen immediately how unsafe it was. On April 16th, the day this ferry is making its way to Jeju Island and is now leaning to one side, ferry workers had loaded twice the legal limit onto the ferry and then hadn't properly secured really any of it. So there were cars and shipping containers that were not tethered. So as the badly balanced Seawall ferry is making its way out to Jeju Island, it hits some very strong currents and makes a sharp turn to avoid them, causing the ship to begin to keel over. As soon as it begins to keel over, all those unsecured cars and containers all shift all at once to one side of the ship, causing it to completely roll over on its side and begin sinking. On board were 476 passengers, of which 325 were high school students on a school trip. As soon as the ship comes to rest on its side, the captain comes over the intercom and tells everybody to stay in your rooms and await further instruction. And everybody listens. They all stay in their room. And honestly, you can't blame them because they're on a routine ferry trip that happens dozens of times a day without any incident. And the captain of the ship is telling you everything's fine. You just stay where you are. We'll tell you what to do next. After a little while, a lot of the students start to feel a little bit anxious because there's been no further instruction. They're still sideways, and they're starting to realize that if they needed to, it would be hard to get out of the ship. A lot of them were way into the bowels of the ship, and they would literally need to climb up and out of the ship to safety. A student actually called the authorities and said, "Hey, I think the ship I'm on is sinking." And the authorities hadn't heard of it because the captain and the crew of the ship were just totally crippled and could not make a decision and had wasted all this time that they could have been evacuating people and getting help, and instead were just panicked and frozen in terror. There would be over 20 calls from students pleading with authorities to come save them because now they know the ship is sinking because they can hear the sound of water rushing into the ship, and it's just a matter of time before it reaches them. Finally, almost an hour after the ship had originally keeled over onto its side, the captain issues the evacuation call to the whole ship. But at this point, water's already getting into the compartments where these students have been told to stay, and students aren't able to leave, and there's this panic to get out of the ship. So the evacuation order was doing nothing. It was already too late. One person who survived, who had left early and disobeyed the stay in your room order, they had climbed to the top of the ship, which was really the side of the ship, and they were looking down into the ship through a hallway. And they said there was this mass of people that were coming out of their rooms and trying to climb up this hallway right as a rush of water poured in through the side of this hallway and completely filled it, and they were gone. Later on, when divers would go down to recover the bodies, they would find that many of the students had broken fingers from desperately trying to climb up those hallways when water was pouring in on them. After the divers recovered the bodies, investigators began going through their cell phones to get some sense of what happened. And on their phones were these tragic pictures and videos of these students staying in their rooms like they were told to do, just waiting for their captain to give them further instruction that never came. The captain actually abandoned ship right after that 9:30 call to evacuate came, when hundreds of students were still down below. He left the ship. So they were totally on their own, just waiting for help that never came. Of the 476 passengers, 304 would perish, and many believe that almost all of them could have been saved had they just evacuated as soon as the ship keeled over. And so as a result of his gross negligence, the captain was given a life sentence. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please put hot dog water ice cubes in the like button's lemonade. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username is the same on both platforms. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called MrBallen. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, guys, that's going to do it. See ya. A more accurate title for this video could be The Worst Ways to Die. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go over to the like button's house and ask to play hide and go seek. When they are hiding, switch their regular coffee for decaf coffee, and then don't seek them, just leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Nicknamed the Great Grey Green Greasy, the Limpopo River is one of Africa's largest rivers. It serves as a border between Zimbabwe and South Africa, and it also happens to be one of the most dangerous places on Earth. A town in South Africa called Veylora sits on Limpopo's shores, and all of its residents know they're never supposed to step foot inside of the dangerous waterway. But not all of their residents take that guidance seriously. On January 1st, 2010, Veylora resident Mariska Buitendog, along with her boyfriend and 6 of their other friends, had been out all night partying, celebrating the new year. They had had a considerable amount of alcohol over the course of the night, so as the sun was coming up, in their inebriated state, they decided they wanted to take an early morning dip in the Limpopo River. So they head over to the river, and while initially they all seemed really eager to get in the waterway, it was only Mariska that was brave enough to do it. So the rest stayed on shore, and Mariska jumped in the river and jumped right out again. And she survived, and everyone was very impressed with her. And so she's confident, and so she does it again, this time going a little bit farther out into the river before coming back on shore. Now she's really confident, she's done it twice, and so she said, hey, who wants to come with me for a third time in? And the group said, no, we're still good, and you really shouldn't push your luck. This is not safe. And she said, I don't care, I'm going in for a third time. So Mariska gets in the water, and by herself, she swims out on her back about 15 meters away from shore. She turns and waves at the group and smiles before she is violently pulled under the water. There wasn't even time for her to scream. Her boyfriend immediately jumped into the water to try to pull her out, but he knew where she was, and there was no way he was getting her back. The other nickname for the Limpopo River is Crocodile River, and Mariska, unfortunately, had fell victim to one of its apex predators. But it's not just drunk partygoers that fall victim to these crocodiles. Unfortunately for the residents of Zimbabwe, because of the extreme hardships they have to face, many of them have been forced to flee the country and cross over the Limpopo River to try to gain entry into South Africa. And many of them will die trying. On April 11th, 2014, Zimbabwean and South African police discovered this crocodile-infested cave right near where Zimbabwean residents will try to cross over the Limpopo River. And inside of this cave were the remains of 15 people that presumably tried to cross over and were caught by crocodiles. The discovery of this cave and the 15 people who lost their lives inside of it, while tragic and certainly gruesome, it only represents a fraction of the total number of people who have died trying to cross this river. Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming is one of the most remarkable and beautiful places on Earth. Not only is it renowned for its biodiversity, which includes some incredibly resilient microbial organisms, it's also home to one of the world's so-called supervolcanoes. This supervolcano sits atop one of the world's largest magma bodies fueled by an upwelling plume of superheated material. This dynamic and violent subterranean plumbing means the water bodies at the surface, the famous Yellowstone hot springs, are highly acidic and incredibly hot. If you were to ignore the countless warnings around these hot springs telling you to stay away, do not go in the hot springs, if you were to ignore those and go in one, or more accurately, fall in one, this is what would happen to you. First, your body would register that your skin was bathing in waters exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This would hurt like nothing you can possibly imagine. But it would only hurt as long as your nervous system was able to register pain, which would only be for about 1 minute or less. At this temperature, your skin would begin to quickly break down and disintegrate, and your blood vessels in your underlying dermis would rupture, causing rapid blood loss. Some underlying skin layers would not break down, but they would lose all of their water and become tough and blackened. And your underlying subcutaneous fat would bubble off as well. All in all, this is known as a full thickness burn, and it would occur in about 1 minute in these waters. Your nervous system would enter a state of shock and become irreversibly damaged, which would lead to most, if not all, of your organs to fail if the heat stress has not already done that to you. You would be dead within 2 to 3 minutes, and then at that point, the acidity of the water would take over. Within a few hours, your body, including your skeleton, would be completely dissolved into absolute nothingness. And for anyone who falls in but manages to climb out again before being dissolved, they are not out of the woods. Many of those people, unfortunately, will die hours, days, months later due to complications from the burns. On June 7, 2016, Colin Scott and his sister Sable went to Yellowstone to see the famous hot springs. The siblings were exploring the Norris Geyser Basin, which is the park's oldest and hottest thermal area, when they decided to leave the safety of the boardwalk and walk past all the signs telling them, do not leave the boardwalk, this is dangerous, turn around. They decided to walk past all of those and venture out off the course. They walked approximately 200 meters away from the path to the edge of a hot spring that was not really part of the main tour, and they were just standing there when Colin apparently tripped and fell into the hot spring. And his sister was just not able to do anything. She knew she couldn't go in after him, and he very quickly sunk below the surface and didn't come up again. She ran back to try to get help, but by the time they got back to the edge of the hot spring, he was gone. And in fact, the only thing they would find of Colin Scott was his flip-flops. Since 1890, Colin Scott, along with 21 other people, have died by falling into these hot springs. There is a remote cliff face in northern England that rarely gets tourists. If you were standing in front of it, you would see this little stream that went into a break in the limestone. It's this little tiny hole, and that stream is called the Mossdale Beck. If you crouched down and walked through that hole, you would be entering the Mossdale Caverns, which since 1967 have been permanently sealed off to cavers. Once inside the Mossdale Caverns entranceway, you could look down and see that little stream, the Mossdale Beck, would be going between your legs, and then right in front of you, it would split in two distinct directions down respective tunnels. To the right, the water flows down 7 miles of accessible passageway. However, most of it is incredibly tight and it's prone to flooding. As a result, fewer people have seen the far reaches of the right side of Mossdale Cavern than have stepped on the moon. To the left, the water goes through these impenetrable rocks that no one has gotten past. In fact, no one knows what's beyond these rocks. However, scientists have determined the water that goes left at the entranceway will re-emerge 18 days later, 5 miles away, 900 feet lower in a pool called the Black Keld. The massive tunnel system that we know exists but has yet to be explored that connects the entranceway to Black Keld is referred to as the missing link. You would think cavers from all over the world would be clamoring to get inside that accessible side, the right side of Mossdale Caverns, and try to find a secret access point back to the missing link, to be the first person to discover that, to stake your claim and say, that was me. But in fact, since the Mossdale Caverns was discovered in 1941 until 1967, almost no one went in Mossdale Caverns. Endless, tight, water-filled crawls with names like Drown or Glory made Mossdale Caverns feel like too big of a risk to be worth it. But in 1967, 10 extremely fit, extremely experienced cavers said, you know what? We are going in Mossdale Cavern and we are going to find that entrance to the missing link. So on June 24th, 1967, these 10 cavers entered Mossdale Caverns. They went right into the accessible 7 miles of passageway and they began their descent. And it wasn't that long until 2 of the 10 cavers, the 2 least experienced of the group, said, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. Got a bad feeling about this, but we don't know the way out. And so they needed chaperones to leave. And so 2 other cavers from the group had to go with them. So 4 cavers, they leave Mossdale Caverns. The other 6 are going to continue on. So when the 4 got back to the surface, it was about 5 p.m. They had been in the cavern for several hours at this point. And when they went in initially, the weather was great. It was beautiful. It was clear. Now they're coming out again and it had started to rain. Not significantly, it was more like a drizzle, but they were a little bit concerned because they knew the other 6 were planning to be in the cavern until after midnight. So they were just hopeful that the rain did not get any worse. But just a couple of hours later, the skies opened up and it rained like it hadn't rained in years. Just torrential downpour, and the 4 were really concerned about the other 6. So they went back to the entrance hoping that maybe, the other 6 would have heard the rain, although it's very unlikely considering how deep they were going to be. But they were hoping that maybe they'd be coming out again and they would see them and get them back to safety. But when they arrived there, not only were the 6 not out of the cave, but the actual entrance to the cave was completely submerged in water. Earlier that day, when the 4 cavers turned around and left, the other 6 cavers, they continued on, and they had made it about 2 miles deep into these caves. They had passed the fabled Drown or Glory swim, they had survived the knee wrecker passage, and they had bit their tongue as they squeezed through the famously painful Umaguli tunnel, now located hours away from the only way out. So they are way into this cave. They were nearing the end of this distant section of the cave that they believed on the other end they would find this hidden entrance into the missing link. All they had to do was pass through the far marathon section, which is a 900-foot tunnel that is only 10 inches high, 2 feet wide, and you have to wriggle through on your stomach with your face pressed against a stream that runs through it. And it takes a very long time to get through it. It's incredibly claustrophobia inducing. It's considered one of the most stressful things you can do in caving. But considering how experienced these cavers were and the fact that they had come down there specifically to get to this far point in the cave, you got to figure that their spirits were high. They were probably joking with each other as they're doing this awful thing. And then they made it about 3/4 of the way through this tunnel when someone must have noticed the distant rumbling sound and said, "Hey, what is that?" And as they sat there listening, trying to discern what the sound was, it must have dawned on them that their worst nightmare was about to come true. That was the sound of surging water. This tunnel is about to flood. They began crawling faster and faster down the marathon tunnel. Not only was it very difficult to move quickly inside of this very tight tunnel, but they also knew there was nowhere to go. They're 2 miles underground. They must have felt like the world of sunshine and fresh air was suddenly an eternity away. The oldest of the group was 26. The rest of them were all in their teens. United now by fear, the water came rushing in as they're all pinned inside of the far marathon tunnel, and their face is already up against the river, and now this river is surging with water. And so they're all desperately trying to crawl through this flooding tunnel, and the leader of the group, the guy literally in the front, John Ogden, who was 26, he managed to get all the way through the far marathon tunnel to the space where they anticipated finding that secret entrance into the missing link. That wasn't there, but he found above him there was a small fissure in the rocks. There was an air pocket, and he managed to get his head up into the space right as the water in the far marathon cave completely submerged. So any of the cavers in there, they drowned inside of the far marathon. The bubble that he was in was a little bit bigger, and so some of the cavers managed to get in there, and they tried to clamber into this air pocket as well, but ultimately there was only enough room for one person, and John was the only one up there. And so as the water levels filled the room he was in up to his neck, everyone below John drowned. Now, we don't know if John literally kept other people from getting into this air pocket with him. All we know is it could only hold one person, and ultimately John was the one who was left inside of this crevice. But this air pocket was really just delaying the inevitable because there wasn't very much air inside of it, and John's 2 miles below the surface. There is no way anyone is going to get to him in time. And so he ended up dying a couple days later, and when they found him, he was still in the air pocket trying to get one last breath. What I've not covered in this story that I would encourage you all to check out is there was this incredible effort to try to save these cavers before anyone knew they were deceased. There was this hope that maybe they found an air pocket and they were still alive. And so they basically created this artificial dam that was very precarious. The water could at any moment spill over, and it provided just enough drainage inside of this cavern for some of the best cavers in the world to go into the cavern to look for them. And so they went into this cavern knowing at any minute that makeshift dam on the surface could break and they will 100% drown in here. No one's coming to get them. They had to crawl through the far marathon tunnel all the way down at the bottom to get to the lost cavers. And ultimately, when they discovered they were all deceased, it would have been impossible to remove their bodies. And so the decision was made to leave these 6 cavers where they died and seal off the cave permanently. So in 1967, they sealed it off, and they now treat Mossdale Caverns like a gravesite, and no one goes in it. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please go over to the like button's house and ask to play hide and seek. When the like button is hiding, switch their regular coffee with decaf coffee, and then do not seek the like button, just leave. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, we have a very special bonus video for you guys. It's a collection of 5 true crime stories, and the first story you'll hear is actually a story I told on a live stream. That's the only place I've ever published the story, so if you missed the live stream, you missed the story until today, because we pulled that story out of the live stream footage, we edited that story, and it's going to be included in today's video. The other 4 stories are fan favorites and some of the most disturbing cases we've ever covered. Now, even if you've seen one of these 4 other stories before, don't worry, they have been completely re-edited, so it will be like a brand new viewing experience. But before we get into those 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to fill up the like button's new waterbed, but instead of using water, use quick-drying cement. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On June 7th, 2008, a middle-aged woman named Kim Spengler was working at this family paint shop. She worked there, she'd been there for several years, and she was stocking shelves, going about her day, when one of her colleagues came up to her and tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Hey, Kim, there's an alarm going off in the parking lot and we think it's your car." And Kim immediately, when she heard this, she became totally like panicked. She thanked the colleague and said, okay. And then Kim, she went to the counter where she had stashed her purse and she grabbed her keys out of her purse, her car keys, and she put the keys into her fists like brass knuckles. She put the key kind of pointing up out of her hand. And so she's kind of holding her keys like a weapon. And she makes her way towards the door. This is in North Carolina, suburban North Carolina. It was in the middle of the summer, super hot. And she's got these keys in her hand, and she steps outside into the blazing heat, and she can hear the alarm going off. And she looks, and she can see it's her car. It's definitely going off. But for Kim, it's like she wasn't really focused on the car. She's sort of anxiously looking around the parking lot, looking for any sudden movement. She's looking if anybody's coming up to her. I mean, she's totally on edge. And the reason for this is because recently Kim had left a very toxic relationship with her boyfriend, a guy named Ricky Simmons, who was 49 years old. Ricky and Kim had connected 5 years earlier when Kim was going through a really dark time in her life. She was struggling with substance abuse. She was just at a low point, and Ricky also was sort of at a low point too in his life. He also was struggling with substance abuse. He had just gotten out of jail. He had served time for manslaughter, in fact. And Kim, I think that she basically looked at him as being sort of like a troubled soul, but somebody that, still had a heart of gold in there somewhere. Like there was a kinship there. There was a relatability. And so that was 5 years ago from this point in the parking lot with the car alarm. However, a few months earlier, Kim had gotten the strength and become sober. And when she became sober, well, one, Ricky didn't like it. Ricky was sort of not an advocate of hers at all. And so they ended up breaking up, and it was a very rocky breakup. Kim at first thought that Ricky would sort of just get over it, but Ricky began effectively stalking Kim. He began showing up at her apartment unannounced. This is a few months earlier. It got to the point where Kim actually filed a restraining order against Ricky because he was becoming so sort of unhinged. He was so unhappy about, what had happened, about the breakup. On top of that, there was something else that really was sitting in the back of Kim's mind, which was, Ricky wasn't just this unhappy boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. He also was the primary suspect in the disappearance of his son's fiance. He had a 22-year-old son, and his son had a fiance. Her name was Jamie Fraley. And around the same time that Kim broke up with Ricky not only became sort of obsessed with Kim and became her stalker, but he also sort of began a lot of the same behaviors with Jamie, again, his son's fiance. And about a month after Kim and Ricky had broken up, Jamie went missing. And Ricky was the primary suspect in her disappearance. And he was actively being investigated for her disappearance. So, from Kim's perspective, she knows that Ricky is, he's an ex-con. He served time for manslaughter. He knows that he's being investigated for this disappearance. And so she's constantly on edge here. Like, despite her restraining order, she does not feel like that's actually going to keep Ricky out of her life. She's very scared of him. And so when her alarm went off, her first thought is, it's got to be Ricky. Maybe he's broken into my car. Maybe he's setting a trap for me, whatever it is. And so as she goes outside, that's what's going through her head. Anyhow, so she gets out in the parking lot. It's blazing hot. She's got her keys in her hand, and she's looking around, but she doesn't see Ricky. Big open parking lot, bunch of cars. She sees her car. And so she clicks her key fob and turns off the alarm because it is her car that's going off. And she walks through the parking lot and she gets to her car. She kind of is careful as she's walking up to it, making sure nobody's hiding, But when she gets to her car, she sees there's no damage. The car is undamaged. All the windows are rolled up. There's certainly no sign that anybody broke into her car. And so Kim is thinking, okay, clearly what's happened here is, somebody must have just bumped into it. Like, this has nothing to do with Ricky. This is just, I'm on edge, given what's happening in my life. And so again, she's turned off the car alarm. She checks her car, again, just to make sure, Ricky's not here, and he's not. There's nothing going on with her car. And she ends up going back into the paint shop. And so she goes back in the paint shop and she finishes up her shift.
And by the time her shift ends, which was only a few hours later, she hadn't forgotten about the car alarm thing, because Ricky and sort of the torment he was causing in her life was really front of mind for her. And so when she left the paint shop now to go home, she had calmed down, but she's walking through the parking lot, going back to her car, just again on edge. She's got her keys, poking out of her hand as a weapon. She gets to her car and there's nobody there. She immediately hops inside, shuts the door, locks it, turns it on, blasts the AC. And it's she can relax. Okay, she's safe in her car. But as she's sitting there, she sort of took stock of the fact that her car was kind of a mess. Now, normally Kim was a very organized and clean person. She was very tidy. But really over the past few months that she'd been dealing with this saga, which was the Ricky saga, she had sort of, kind of fallen off on regular duties, like keeping her car clean, that type of thing. But she knew the next day, which was Sunday, she was going to be going to church early in the morning, and she had volunteered to drive some of her church friends to church. And so she's thinking as she's sitting in the car, exhausted from the day, oh, okay, the car is kind of smelly, and there's trash, and there's clothes, and there's this. She said, I got to clean out my car when I get home because I don't want to, roll up to my friends tomorrow for church and have this car be smelly and gross. And so she tells herself, as soon as I get home, I'm going to clean my car. And for what it's worth, she typically did do that. Most nights, she would clean her car out, take out the clothes, whatever. But, after her drive, finally ended and she got home, she just, she was checked out. And she's like, you know what? I know I need to take out my dirty clothes and take out the trash and clean up, but I just don't have it in me. So I'll just get up early tomorrow, I'll clean out my car, and then I'll, go about my day. So she gets out of her car, she goes into her apartment, and she goes to bed. The next morning rolls around, and she gets up, except she sleeps through her alarm. She's late. And when she looks at the clock, she realizes she does not have enough time to clean her car. She doesn't really have any time at all. She basically needs to run out of the house, get in her car, and drive and pick up her friends. Otherwise, she's going to be late. She's already late. She sprints out of her house, gets in her car, and right away, she's like, oh my goodness, it's so messy, it smells bad. And she starts driving and she's taking trash and jamming it into the different compartments, doing her best to kind of make it look a little bit more presentable. She rolled the windows down to get some fresh air. But, she ended up picking up her friends for church. And, as soon as they get in, they're very polite. No one's going to call Kim out. They sort of know she's going through a rough time, but it was pretty obvious. They were kind of grossed out by the condition of her car. And, Kim's very apologetic. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry it smells. I'm sorry it's dirty. I should have taken care of this. Next time I will. And they're like, oh, don't worry about it. And so they end up going to church. And after church, Kim went off on her own and sort of spent the day running errands. And around 6 p.m., she ends up coming back to her house. She's done for the day. She pulls into her parking space and immediately she's like, okay, I need to clean my car. This is a full day overdue here. I got to clean my car. And so she starts cleaning her car. She pulls a trash can over. She takes the trash out of the main cabin of the car. She takes out, work stuff and papers. And then once the interior of the car had been straightened up, she went around to the trunk, because in the trunk was her dirty clothes. And so Kim, she goes to the trunk, she opens it up, flips it open, and she freezes when she sees what's in her trunk. So to understand what she found in the trunk, we have to go back 24 hours. So 24 hours earlier, this is back on Saturday, Kim, her car alarm was going off. So it turns out she was right to suspect that potentially Ricky could have been involved with her car alarm. And I'll explain why. Every Saturday for forever, Kim had a very particular routine. Every Saturday, she would go to the gym in the morning, she would change out of her clothes, and she would put her gym clothes in the trunk, put on her work clothes, she'd go to work, and then in the evening, she would get home and take those dirty clothes out and clean them. That was her routine, and it was such a routine that, Ricky was aware of that routine. And so on Saturday, when she's at work, when the car alarm went off, it was Ricky. Ricky had broken into her car. Ricky knew that at the end of the day, she's going to open up that trunk to take her dirty clothes from the gym and bring them inside and do the laundry. But unfortunately for Ricky, Kim didn't do that, right? So Ricky, he breaks into her car and he climbs into her trunk. And in hand is a knife. He's holding a knife. And he closes the trunk on himself, knowing again, based on her routine, that she's going to open that up at the end of the night and he can spring out and attack her. But because of Kim's torment from Ricky and how scatterbrained she was, she didn't empty her trunk that night. And so for 24 hours, Ricky stayed in the trunk with that knife, and he eventually cooked to death. And so when she opened it up, he was dead and decomposing in the trunk, still clutching that knife. In addition to that, unfortunately, Jamie Fraley, so Ricky's son's fiance, her body was never found. She was never found. And police still suspect that Ricky had murdered her, but we don't know what happened to her. But what almost certainly happened is simply because Kim did not open the trunk that night, she saved her own life.
Last year, we launched our very first graphic novel, and it went great. I mean, it made the New York Times bestseller list, so thank you all so much for making that happen. But ever since this book came out, we have been hit with so many questions about, hey, when are you going to do another graphic novel? When's book 2 coming out? Well, I have an announcement to make. Check it out. We are doing a second graphic novel, and this is the official cover art. Here it is. This is MrBallen Presents Where Nightmares Live. It's going to have another set of 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories. And it comes out September 30th. But you can pre-order it right now if you go to book.ballenstudios.com. Also, there's a link right here and in the description below. There are some signed copies available, but they will go quickly. So please head on over to book.ballenstudios.com to pre-order a copy of our newest graphic novel. I know you're going to love it. Check it out. Your nightmares are waiting. In November of 2004, 52-year-old Peter Porco and his wife, 54-year-old Joan Porco, were like so many other middle-aged, middle-class Americans. They lived in Del Mar, New York, in a comfortable 2-story home, and they worked for a living. Peter was an appellate court clerk, and Joan was a speech pathologist. They had been married for over 30 years, and they had 2 sons. Christopher was a 21-year-old student at the University of Rochester, and his brother, Jonathan, was a 23-year-old naval officer stationed at a submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. On Monday, November 15th, 2004, Peter woke up to start his typical Monday morning work routine. He got up, he got out of bed, he went into the bathroom, he relieved himself, he looked in the mirror, he shaved, he got dressed in his work clothes, he went downstairs, he put on a pot of coffee. While the coffee was brewing, he unloaded the dishwasher and then put the dirty dishes into the dishwasher and started it. He wanted to get his newspaper, so he went outside, he got his newspaper, but he realized he locked himself out of the front door. So he got the spare key out from underneath the mat, opened the front door, went inside, he sat down, had some coffee, read the newspaper. After a few minutes, he put his coffee cup in the sink, he packed himself a lunch in his lunchbox, and then he headed for the door to head for work. Peter was known as a very reliable employee who was also very punctual and rarely missed work. So when he didn't get to work that Monday morning, the court was a little bit confused. They called him to see if he was okay. He didn't pick up. So they dispatched a court officer to go make sure he was okay. And so the officer arrives at his house. He sees cars in the driveway. The front door shut. He goes up. He knocks on the door. Nobody answers. He tries the handle of the front door. He realizes it's open. So he opens the door and he yells out, "Hey, I'm just looking for Peter." And the door hits something on the ground. He pokes his head inside and looks down, and there on the ground, the thing blocking the door, is Peter Porco's body. He's clearly deceased, and he clearly has a massive head wound. The court officer steps outside immediately, calls 911, local police show up, they go inside, and sure enough, Peter is dead. They go upstairs and they find his wife, Joan, in bed, also with a massive head wound, but she was still alive. Joan was rushed to a hospital where she underwent emergency surgery and then was put into a medically induced coma. Meanwhile, the police began their investigation into who could have done this. They quickly discovered that the home's alarm system had been smashed and a phone line, because there still was landlines at the time, had been cut from the outside, and a screen in one of the windows had been slashed that looked like the way someone climbed into the house. However, nothing appeared to have been stolen because police almost immediately found Peter's wallet with money inside of it still sitting in the house, as well as very expensive jewelry that belonged to Joan still sitting in the house. As they continued to search the house, they discovered a fireman's axe that belonged to the Porcos hidden inside of one of the bedroom closets, and it was very clear this was the murder weapon. The Porco sons had been away during this attack. John was on his submarine in Connecticut, and Chris was at the University of Rochester, and in fact, Chris found out about the attack on his parents when he saw a news report, because this story of this innocent, typical-seeming American couple in a quiet suburb getting struck down by some axe-wielding maniac had gone totally viral, and it was all over the news. And so Chris called the police to get more information about his parents' death. Here's the recording.
Hi, my name is Chris Porco. I was just called by the Times Union saying that my parents were found dead this afternoon. I was wondering if you had any information for me.
Hey, Chris, whereabouts are you?
I'm at school in Rochester, New York.
Okay, you're in Rochester?
Yes.
Okay, and you're hearing from the Times Union?
Yeah, they said my parents were found, I guess, I don't know, they didn't say how or anything.
So you will be here probably, you're going to go right to Albany Med?
I don't know, I don't even know where my mom is, but...
Yeah, she is at Albany Med.
Okay, do you know her condition?
No, because I haven't talked to her. Let me give you my pager number.
As you can tell, Chris is extremely emotional. He's beside himself. He can barely speak. He's so upset about what's happened to his parents. No, actually, he sounds as calm as if he's ordering a pizza, because Chris Porco was actually a psychopath, and he was the one who attacked his parents with the axe. As it turns out, Chris was failing at school and taking out huge loans in his father's name by forging his signature, and his father found out about it. So Mr. and Mrs. Porco write their son a strongly worded email where they tell him this behavior has to stop, and they're very disappointed in him, but they love him and they will help him get back on his feet. Chris responded by driving home in the middle of the night, sneaking into his house and attacking his parents with an axe. While this case is already disturbing and horrific and tragic, it's what happens to Chris's father after the attack that makes it one of the most brutal cases of all time. After being struck 16 times in the head and laying unconsciously in his bed as his son snuck out of his house, Peter suddenly sat up and began his morning routine. He got dressed, he went to the bathroom, he shaved, he went downstairs, he made coffee, he did his chores, he went outside to get the newspaper, he got locked out, he got the key from under the mat, went back inside, he packed his own lunch. When he was finally ready to go, he headed for the door and then he collapsed and he died. Due to the severity of Peter's head wound, his brain was basically broken and it was unable to recognize he had been gravely injured. So in his final moments, he believed it was just a typical Monday morning going about his work routine, when in reality, he had a gaping head wound and he was basically dead after the 16th blow to his head. One of the more surprising and heart-wrenching details of this case is that Joan Porco, she did survive the attack. And after she came out of that medically induced coma, she said she forgot all the details of the attack, even though when she was discovered in her bed, she did indicate that Chris, her son, was the attacker. Nonetheless, she got together $250,000 to post Chris's bail, and she allowed him to come stay with her during his trial. And the two attended the trial together, walking into the courthouse hand in hand. Chris was very quickly found guilty of killing his father and attempting to kill his mother, and he was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Despite the verdict, Joan Porco still speaks to Christopher over the phone and frequently visits him in prison. It's unclear if she still believes he is innocent. On August 28, 1984, an 18-year-old girl named Elizabeth went missing. On the first day she was gone, her friends and family went out looking for her, but they couldn't find her. The following day, when she still hadn't shown up and no one had heard from her, her parents went to the local police station in their Austrian town of Amstetten, which is about an hour west of Vienna, and they reported her missing. The police launched an initial search of the town and the surrounding areas, but after several weeks, they had found nothing that connected to Elizabeth and where she might have gone. A month after she had been reported missing, her parents came back to the police station, except this time they were carrying a note they say they received in the mail from their missing daughter. It was postmarked from a town that was about 2 hours west of Amstetten, and in this note, Elizabeth writes directly to her parents, and she tells them that she had grown tired of living with them, and she did not want them to come looking for her, and if she discovered they were looking for her, she would just flee the country. After the police read the note, they asked the parents if they thought it was real, if this was a legitimate letter from their daughter, and they said, yeah, they think it is. And then after that, her father, Joseph, suggested that maybe his daughter had run off to join a cult. That was something he thought she was getting into before her disappearance. After the parents left the police station, the police began conducting interviews with other family members and friends of Elizabeth to see if it was possible that she might have run off to join a cult. And virtually everyone they spoke to said, absolutely not. There is no way she ran off to join a cult. That just wasn't her. She was a quiet, reserved person, and they had never heard her talking about a cult or anything anything that even resembled a cult. These answers left the police feeling very suspicious of the whole situation, and so they decided to look into the young woman's history to see if there was some other reason she might have run off. In their research, they discovered that Elizabeth was one of 7 siblings that all lived together with their parents, Joseph and Rose Marie. Joseph was a successful electrical engineer and real estate developer who was well liked and respected in town, and Rose Marie had gotten married very young at the age of 17, and she had stayed home to take care of the kids. By all accounts, from the outside looking in, they were a very ordinary family, but as the police began to dig deeper and deeper into their history, they discovered there were some big problems behind closed doors. Despite his friendly outward public appearance, Joseph was actually a ruthless authoritarian when he was home alone with his family. At night, when he came home from work, his wife and his kids would immediately stop whatever they were doing and go silent in hopes they might avoid a beating. The only member of the family that seemed willing to stand up to Joseph was Elizabeth, and she and her father would frequently get into screaming fights, and then as punishment for these fights, Joseph would not only beat his daughter, he would also prevent her from seeing her friends for long periods of time, and he would go through her personal things like her diary. Their toxic relationship finally came to a head when Elizabeth finally ran away from home 2 years prior to her most recent disappearance. She made it all the way to Vienna before authorities caught up to her and brought her back home. Upon learning about this earlier disappearance, the police became convinced that the most recent disappearance was yet another attempt to escape her abusive and controlling father. And so the police decided that this was more of a family affair, and they didn't push the investigation further. A year went by, and neither the police nor her family heard anything from Elizabeth, and so her case was closed. But 24 years later, a seemingly unconnected event broke her case wide open. On April 19, 2008, a 19-year-old named Kirsten was rushed to the hospital in Amstetten. Her skin was so pale it looked almost transparent. She was unconscious and suffering from seizures as well as lung and kidney failure. The doctors were able to stabilize her by putting her into a medically induced coma, but after running a litany of tests, they couldn't figure out what was causing her to have this medical condition, and so they were not able to treat her effectively. They assumed it had to be some sort of genetic condition, so they put her name into the medical database, but nothing came up. Her name wasn't listed. And so this was very perplexing because everybody's name was in this database. And so they took her name and they ran it in other medical databases, and her name didn't show up in any of them. And so totally confused by this girl who seemingly didn't exist, who was exhibiting symptoms of a condition none of the doctors had seen before, the doctors decide they have to speak to the guy she showed up with, an older man who was out in the waiting room. When the doctors approached him, he said he was Kirsten's grandfather, but beyond that, he offered virtually no new information. In fact, he was aggressive and rude and dismissive, and anytime they asked him questions, he would answer as minimally as possible. And when the doctors really fixated on whether or not Kirsten had some underlying medical condition, he would not give them an answer. He would just dismiss it and say he didn't know anything, but it was the doctor's impression that he did know something, he just didn't want to tell them. And this behavior shocked them because they're thinking the information he has could potentially save his granddaughter's life. Why wouldn't he want to give it to us? And so after this disastrous interaction with the grandfather, the doctors decided to get the police involved. There were just too many red flags not to. When the police arrived, they were surprised to find out that this older man in the waiting room was none other than Joseph, the father of the still missing girl, Elizabeth. The police asked Joseph, "What's going on here?" And he tells them that earlier that day, he had opened his front door of his house, and lying on his front step was a girl he had never seen before. It was Kirsten, and there was a note laying on her from his missing daughter, Elizabeth. In the note, Elizabeth writes to Joseph directly and tells him, "This girl here is Kirsten, and she is my daughter, so she's your granddaughter, and she's sick, and I can't take care of her. Can you and Mom take her to the hospital?" While the police had many more questions about this totally bizarre turn of events, they realized that for the time being, they needed to focus their efforts on just getting Elizabeth to contact them, because they needed to know more about Kirsten's medical condition so they could save her life. And so the police went to the media and they put out a message on TV and on radio that was a direct appeal to Elizabeth that basically said, "We need you to come forward as soon as possible and speak to us so we can help save your daughter's life." And all the messages worked, because a week later, Elizabeth, along with her father Joseph, showed up at the hospital where Kirsten was staying. When doctors asked, Joseph did not get into detail about how he actually located Elizabeth. He simply said he found her and now she wants to see her daughter. The doctors noticed that Elizabeth, who was supposed to be in her early 40s, looked like she could easily be in her 60s. Her hair was completely white and her skin was so pale it was almost transparent, just like they had noticed about her daughter's skin. And so after they checked in, Joseph and Elizabeth made their way to Kirsten's room, and the pair went inside, and the doctors that were in there would say that Elizabeth looked terrified. She was hunched over and kind of slouched down, and she wouldn't make eye contact with any of the doctors. And as she was standing there looking at her terribly sick daughter, the doctors began asking her, do you know of any underlying health problems your daughter might have that might help us treat her more effectively? And Elizabeth was so scared she couldn't even talk. And at some point, the questions became too much for her, and she just turned around and walked out into the hall with Joseph. And once they got out into the hall, the police were waiting for them. They had been tipped off as soon as the doctors saw Joseph and Elizabeth come into the hospital. Elizabeth and Joseph were detained and brought to the police station, where they were put in 2 separate rooms to be interviewed. They first interviewed Elizabeth, and initially, just like in the hospital room, she was totally mute and didn't say anything. And for 5 hours, the police grilled her with questions. Where had she been for the last 24 years? What happened to Kirsten? Did she have something to do with her illness? And they kept reminding her throughout these 5 hours that if she never gave them any information, and God forbid something were to happen to Kirsten, she, Elizabeth, could be held criminally liable. And so eventually Elizabeth, in a very small, meek voice, said, okay, I'll tell you the story, but you have to promise me I never have to see my father, Joseph, ever again. When she said this to the police, they could tell she was so scared that they said, okay, fine. You never have to see your father again. We'll make sure of it. Now tell us what happened. After that, Elizabeth clutched her hands. She took a deep breath, and then she told them one of the most horrifying stories they had ever heard. A story so disturbing that it would make headlines all around the world for months. It all began 24 years earlier on August 28, 1984, the day Elizabeth went missing. On that day, she told police she was at her family home in Amstetten when her father asked her to come into the basement to help him with something. Her father, for the last several years, had been constructing a bomb shelter in their basement, and he was now only 1 door installation away from being done. At the time, in the early 1980s, the Cold War was still very much on, and so building bomb shelters inside of your home was a relatively common thing. So Elizabeth goes down into her basement, and she sees her father standing in front of this empty frame where this door is going to go that leads into the shelter. And so she walks over and steps through the frame into the shelter. She turns around and her father hands her this door, and she holds it in the middle of the frame while he secures it to the hinges. And then once it's securely in place, suddenly he swings open the door, knocking Elizabeth backwards farther into the shelter. And before she could stand back up again, her father had run inside and pushed an ether-soaked towel onto her face, knocking her unconscious. When she came to again, she found herself chained up in the very back room of the shelter. It would turn out this bomb shelter that Joseph had spent 6 years constructing was not actually a bomb shelter. It was a prison he was building specifically for Elizabeth. To get into this shelter, you would have to go down the steps into the basement, which looked like a typical unfinished basement. And then on the far wall, you would see these shelves that had things like paint cans and screwdrivers and other tools you would expect to find in a basement. But if you walked over to the left side of the shelving, there was a lock on the back of it that if you undid it, the shelf itself would swing out like a door, and then behind it on the wall would reveal a 3-foot tall secret door. This secret door was also locked, but not by a key lock. Instead, it was locked by a keypad lock that only Joseph had the code to. And since Joseph was an electrical engineer, he took great care in ensuring this lock never could be tampered with or destroyed. That thing was going to stay locked unless he unlocked it. When Joseph entered his code into the keypad, he could open that secret door and it would reveal this secret underground prison that was basically a winding maze of small rooms with ceilings that were too short to be able to stand up all the way in. If you walked through this secret door and actually entered into this prison, you would start by entering this soundproof narrow hallway that went on for several feet before it entered into this very small bathroom area where the bathroom was unbelievably cramped and there was no doors, there was no privacy. And then if you didn't stop in the bathroom and you just kept walking straight through that first hallway, you would reach another hallway that was totally soundproof and narrow, and at the end of that hallway it would feed into a very small bedroom that was so small that it barely contained the one bed that was inside of it, and then off to the right side of that bedroom was another door that led into a similarly sized bedroom. All of the walls of this underground prison were made of thick reinforced concrete. That, combined with the soundproofing that Joseph had installed throughout the entire prison, meant no one could hear Elizabeth's cries for help. Also, the inside of the prison was heavily monitored by Joseph's security system, so truly Elizabeth had absolutely no privacy.
She was completely trapped, and the only way she was getting out was if her father freed her. For the first 5 years of her imprisonment, she remained in that dungeon all alone. Her only connection to the outside world was her father, who would come down almost every night to drop off basic supplies and to assault her. As far as Joseph's wife and his other kids knew, he was just spending all this time in the basement because that's where he worked when he was not at the office. In 1988, Elizabeth became pregnant with her father's child. She was terrified of the pregnancy and begged Joseph to at least allow her to deliver the child in a hospital. But he refused. He wasn't willing to potentially expose himself for what he was doing. And so he gave her a book about childbirth, and he gave her a pair of scissors to cut the umbilical cord, and he said, good luck. And so on August 30th, Elizabeth delivered her daughter, Kirsten, alone in that basement. Following the birth of Kirsten, Elizabeth would deliver 6 more of her father's children, all the same way she delivered Kirsten, alone and in the basement. In 1996, one of Elizabeth's newborn babies, Michael, was born with respiratory issues, and so Elizabeth pleaded with Joseph to take the baby to the hospital to get help, but Joseph refused. He was worried he would be exposed. And so 3 days after his birth, the baby died in Elizabeth's arms. And after the baby died, Joseph just took the body, threw it in a stove, and incinerated it like it was nothing. In the late 90s, the 6 living children down in the basement were getting bigger and noisier, and so Joseph came up with a plan in order to reduce the chances of them being discovered. And so one day, Joseph went downstairs into the basement, and he took one of Elizabeth's youngest children away from her. And then he threatened her and the rest of the kids down there that if they tried to fight back or if they ever tried to escape, he would seal off the basement and he would gas them to death. Previously, Joseph had punished the entire family by turning off their power and cutting off their food and water supply for multiple days at a time, so they knew he was willing and able to hurt them if he wanted to. And so when he took this young child away from Elizabeth, they didn't put up a fight, and the baby disappeared upstairs. And when Joseph's wife, Rosemary, came home, he put on this elaborate charade about how he had discovered this baby on the front step, and that there was a note attached to the baby, and it was from Elizabeth, their missing daughter, and this child was apparently Elizabeth's, and she couldn't take care of it, and she was leaving it here for he and Rosemary to raise it as their own. And Joseph had actually made Elizabeth write out this note and sign it to add credibility to the story. And so when Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, saw this note and heard Joseph's story, she believed it. Over the next several years, Joseph would steal 2 more of Elizabeth's young children and then stage having found them on his front step with a note from Elizabeth. And with each discovered child, Rosemary amazingly never asked any questions. She just took these kids in, and she and Joseph raised them as their own. Eventually, when these 3 kids got old enough, Joseph would tell them that their real mother, Elizabeth, was a lowlife and she had abandoned them and she didn't care about them, when in reality, their mother and their other 3 siblings they didn't know existed were locked up in the basement below their feet. Initially, investigators believed all of these children Joseph had with Elizabeth were all mistakes, but it would turn out that was not the case. Joseph would admit that the reason he initially imprisoned Elizabeth was because he wanted to completely control her. He wanted to own her. And so he decided that if he could just impregnate her as many times as possible and make her have all these kids, even if she eventually got out of the prison, no man would want her. She had too many kids, and so she would remain his property. And so over the entire time Elizabeth was imprisoned, over 2 decades, the nightly assaults by her father never slowed down. They happened thousands of times. But despite the horrific and tragic circumstances surrounding each of her children's births, she loved her children unconditionally and would spend all of her time doing her best to educate them and care for them. The 3 children that remained with her, that were not taken by Joseph, she taught them how to read and how to write. And when Joseph had given them a TV and a radio to keep down there, she would use those 2 items to try to teach her kids about the outside world, and she would promise them that someday they would get to experience it for real. Finally, in 2008, so 24 years after Elizabeth had originally been captured by her father, her oldest daughter, Kirsten, becomes extremely sick, and Elizabeth convinces Joseph to bring her to the hospital. And 1 week later, Joseph's heinous crimes were revealed to the world. Once police found out about the secret prison, they rushed to the house and they went downstairs and they used the codes and instructions that Joseph had given them, and they went inside and they freed the last 2 remaining children that were still there. When they brought them to the hospital, the youngest of these 2 kids, who was 5 years old, he didn't speak the entire time. He just pressed his face up against the glass of the car window and he stared out in utter amazement, because to that point in his life, he had never actually seen the world. After those two kids were brought to the hospital, they were reunited with the other three siblings that had been taken away from them years ago to live upstairs with Joseph and Rosemary. And apparently the reunion was very emotional and the kids were extremely happy to see each other. And then a couple days later, Kirsten would come out of her coma and she too would have a chance to be reunited with all of her siblings. Kirsten would ultimately make a full recovery. It would turn out she was suffering from a severe vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D you primarily get from the sun, and in her 19 years of life, she had never been in the sun. As soon as the story broke about this family being trapped inside of this basement, everybody had the same question. How could Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, not know what was going on in her basement? But the police had the same suspicions about Rosemary, and they investigated her, and they ruled her out. And they said she's not at fault here, she's a victim too. She had been so badly abused by Joseph that she lived in fear of him. And so when he forbade her from ever going anywhere near the basement, she listened. And if she ever heard any strange sounds coming out of the basement, or if she ever suspected any strange behavior by Joseph, she kept those thoughts to herself because she was scared. It's also worth noting that in those 24 years that Elizabeth and her kids were trapped in the basement, Joseph had over 100 people rent out a room inside of his house that was right over the basement. And in those 24 years, not one of those tenants ever said Joseph was acting strangely or complained about strange noises coming from the basement. However, one tenant who was there for a 4-year stretch had a dog with him the whole time, and every night the dog at some point would suddenly stand up, its ears would prick up, and it would start growling like it heard or it saw something. And at first, this tenant would try to see what the dog had seen or heard, but after never seeing anything, he would always just dismiss the dog when it did this at night. Later on, when that tenant figured out what was actually happening inside the house while he was there, he realized his dog was most likely hearing the faint sounds of the family that was imprisoned right below him. After a year of therapy and rehabilitation, Elizabeth and her 6 kids were given new identities by the Austrian government, and they were sent off to a secret location to start their lives over. As such, there's virtually no information about how they're doing today. However, anonymous sources have come forward and said the family has successfully reintegrated into society, and they are all leading relatively normal and happy lives. As for Joseph, he was quickly given a life sentence, and today he is one of the most hated people in his prison due to the nature of his crimes. He is so hated that in 2016, when he was out in general population, he was attacked by other inmates and had several of his teeth knocked out. And so now prison officials are worried if they leave him in general population, he'll be killed. And so he spends virtually all of his time in solitary confinement. He will be eligible for parole in 2024 when he is 89 years old. Robert Pickton was born in 1949 in Port Coquitlam in British Columbia, which is about 15 miles to the east of Vancouver. He, along with his brother and sister, were raised by their parents on a big pig farm. In the 1970s, their parents passed away, and so the property was handed down to them. Robert and his brother took over the daily operations of the farm, and their sister decided to just move away. Over the next couple of decades, Robert and his brother attempted to run the pig farm, but pretty quickly they stopped taking care of it, and it fell into decline. Neighbors and visitors recalled seeing the pigs that were still there free roaming the property. And as for the brothers, it appeared they had just stopped bathing, and despite walking all day in mud and pig feces, it seemed like they never took off their boots when they went inside. One of the few farm workers that stayed with the Picktons through the farm's decline was a guy by the name of Bill Hiscox, and he said the farm was a really creepy place. And he also said Robert was a really creepy guy that was prone to just totally bizarre behavior, even though he didn't smoke or drink or use any substances. Eventually, the Pickton brothers realized they were not cut out to run the pig farm like their family had for generations before them, and they decided their best move was just to sell portions of their land. But neither of them could have guessed just how much their land was worth. From 1994 to 1995, they managed to sell off almost all of their property to an urban developer for over $5 million. And so suddenly, these filthy, failed pig farmers had become millionaires, and neither of them knew what to do with the money. After a year of just sitting on the money and not doing much with it, they decided they wanted to do some good with their money. And so they established an official charity in 1996 called the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. Their charity's purpose, at least on paper, was to help raise money for various organizations that they deemed worthy by running events like dances and shows.
And while that might have been their original intention for this charity, what it ultimately became was a guise to host these wild drug and alcohol-fueled parties inside of their slaughterhouse, which, even though it wasn't being used anymore because they were no longer really doing any pig farming, it still conspicuously had big hooks coming down from the ceiling and bloodstains all over the ground underneath them. These Piggy Palace parties became infamous in Coquitlam, drawing crowds of up to 2,000 people, predominantly bikers, drug addicts, and prostitutes from the poverty-stricken downtown east side of Vancouver. Robert had become familiar with that part of Vancouver because he used to go through there all the time to dispose of animal waste products at their rendering plant. Once the Piggy Palace charity was in full swing, Robert started going back into that neighborhood where he would cruise down the 10-block strip called the Low Track and would attempt to recruit people to come to his parties. Most of the people he recruited were down on their luck women who only agreed to go because he was offering them food and money and drugs and alcohol. At the same time Robert was running this recruiting campaign, women from the downtown east side began disappearing in droves. These disappearances were noticed by the men and women in the downtown east side, but they didn't report them because they had a general distrust of the police and of authority figures in general. But as more and more and more women disappeared from the downtown east side, rumors of a serial killer operating in that area started to circulate. Residents began only going outside if they could walk around in a big group of people, and everybody was just totally on edge, keeping careful lookout for anything odd about the neighborhood, people that shouldn't be there, cars that shouldn't be there. But despite this heightened security, women continued to go missing at a rapid rate and nobody knew why. When the police were finally contacted about all these missing women, their response was lacking, to say the least. Since there were no bodies of these missing women, the police said it was reasonable to assume that the women were to blame, that their lifestyles must have caught up with them and they either ran off somewhere or perhaps they overdosed somewhere and their bodies just haven't been found yet. Despite residents of the downtown east side saying, no, this is different, there's something wrong here, the police basically said, we're not getting involved. When the newspapers found out about this totally apathetic response from the police, they criticized them for intentionally deprioritizing these missing women because the majority of them were drug addicts and prostitutes, and so therefore weren't worthy of a full investigation. The police rejected this claim. On the evening of March 22nd, 1997, so 1 year after the Piggy Palace had been stood up and they started throwing all these parties, and 1 year after dozens of women have gone missing from the downtown east side, the Picton's neighbor heard a frantic knock on their front door. They ran over, they opened it up, and what they saw was this woman who was hunched over with one hand on her bleeding stomach, and dangling from her wrist was a handcuff. The neighbor was obviously shocked at what they were seeing, but they quickly ushered the woman in and they called her an ambulance. The woman was rushed to the hospital where she immediately was put into emergency surgery. Afterwards, while she was in recovery, she told her nurses that her name was Wendy and she had been at one of those Piggy Palace parties, and one of the owners of the farm, Robert Picton, had tried to put a handcuff on her, and when he did, she fought back. He drew a knife, he stabbed her in the stomach, she was able to get the knife back, she stabbed him in the face before turning and running out the door and making it to the neighbor's house. Right after she told this story, Robert Picton actually showed up at the exact same hospital with a serious laceration on his face that was consistent with being stabbed. The medical staff had already called the police, who showed up minutes later, and when they went inside, they searched Robert and they found in one of his pockets a handcuff key. And that handcuff key opened the handcuff that was still on Wendy's wrist. And so when the police saw that, they arrested Robert on attempted murder. While Robert was in custody, he explained to officers that Wendy was lying. She was a drug addict and she had come to one of their Piggy Palace parties and he had caught her trying to rob them. He had confronted her, she drew a knife, and that's when a struggle ensued and both of them got stabbed. And Robert said he was just lucky to be alive. The police believed him and dropped all of his charges and let him go. When Robert got back to the farm, Bill Hiscox, the one worker who still worked for the Pictons, he grew very suspicious of Robert. He had read all about the missing women from the downtown east side, and he knew Robert regularly went over there to pick up women and brought them back to his parties. And Bill just always had that gut feeling that something was off about Robert. And so he sat on this gut feeling for a couple of months until finally he decided he had to tell someone. And so he called the Crime Stoppers tip line and he told them that he thought Robert had actually attacked Wendy, not the other way around, and that actually Robert was most most likely behind some or all of these missing women from the downtown east side. Bill also said that a recent female party guest at the farm had seen a pile of women's clothing inside of Robert's trailer, along with at least 10 purses and women's ID cards. The police followed up with Lisa to confirm what she saw, but she was scared of Robert and said she wasn't going to cooperate. And so the police, without this testimony, were unable to secure a search warrant to investigate this further, and so they kind of just forgot about it and moved on to other cases. Over the next few years, the Pictons continued to throw these huge Piggy Palace parties until the city finally shut them down, and dozens more women disappeared from the downtown east side without a significant police investigation, despite the fact that Bill was calling them all the time to say he believed Robert Picton was behind all of these disappearances, but they weren't taking him seriously. Finally, in 2002, a former employee of the Picton farm came forward to police and said that he personally had seen illegal weapons inside of Robert's trailer. And this was enough information for the police to get a search warrant and raid the pig farm. And in February of that year, they did just that. And they found inside of Robert's trailer the illegal guns, as well as several items directly connected to some of the missing women from the downtown east side. Robert was arrested but let out on bail. He was put under surveillance and told he could not go back to the farm until they were done conducting a more thorough search. And during that more thorough search, they found blood from one of the missing women inside of Robert's trailer. And so Robert was rearrested and charged with murder. While he was being held in jail, he shared his cell with another man who he believed was just another detainee. But he wasn't a detainee, he was actually an undercover police officer, and their entire interaction was being recorded. And on this recording, Robert makes a few shocking statements.
What do you got? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Okay, I know what's up. You got a missing person. We better fucking cut it in there. I thought the best way to dispose of something was take it in the ocean. But even that. No. That's good. Pretty good. Hey? Can't be much left. Can't stop it. Can't stop it. I was doing one more. Maybe 50. That's what I was stopping people for. Fill the syringes up with antifreeze, and you inject yourself, and you're dead in better than 10 minutes. That was just one more. They could even bigger than bigger than lungs in the States. Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is already about 42.
As Robert admits in this video, he killed 49 people, who would turn out to be the majority of the missing women from the downtown east side. After a lengthy investigation, it was determined Robert's killing spree began in 1991, but it really kicked up a notch in 1996 when he and his brother started Piggy Palace, because he was able to use their huge parties to lure more victims to his farm faster. And once they were at his farm, he would lure them into his trailer, where he would handcuff them, tell them it's over now, and he would inject antifreeze into them, or he would strangle them to death. Afterwards, he would move the victim's body to the slaughterhouse, where he would butcher them like a pig. A large portion of his victim's remains would be fed to his pigs, and the parts he didn't feed to his pigs, he would bring to the rendering plant in the downtown east side, which is not far from where the victim was most likely picked up. A rendering plant takes animal waste products, crushes them up, and turns them into a gelatin. This gelatin is used in many everyday products, from candy to cosmetics, which means Robert's victims wound up in things like lipstick and gummy bears. Also, sometimes while Robert was going through this horrific disposal process, he would set aside some of the best cuts of meat and grind them up with pork and turn them into sausage. This sausage was served at Piggy Palace parties. It was also given to neighbors and food banks and orphanages. After sifting through 300,000 cubic meters of soil and pig feces underneath the Picton farm, investigators were only ever able to find little bits of remains of 26 women. Robert was charged with all 26 murders, but only 6 turned into convictions due to a lack of evidence. His brother and sister were never charged in connection with the crimes. In early 1983, residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment complex in North London began complaining about their drains being clogged up. Initially, their landlord was dismissive and said, "Oh, it's just an old building, it's old plumbing, and that's why it's slow." But eventually, the landlord conceded and asked a plumber to come out and have a look. And so, on the evening of February 8th, an experienced plumber named Mike came out to Cranley Gardens, and after learning what the complaints were, he went around to the side of the building and he opened up a drain cover to have a look inside. As expected, when he shined his light down, he saw wads of hair and napkins and other things kind of mashed together, clogging up the pipes. And so he reached in and he began pulling the stuff out and putting it in a bucket right next to him. And then after he had cleared the majority of the obstruction, he reached his arm all the way into this pipe to feel around to see if there was anything in there that he just couldn't see. And at some point, as he was reaching, when his arm was almost completely into this pipe, his hand hit a major blockage. And so he moved his fingers around to try to feel what it was, but he couldn't tell. It was something that was fairly soft, but there were some hard things inside of it, like sticks or rods. So he grabbed a handful of this blockage and he pulled his arm back out of the pipe. He opened his hand, and what he was holding looked like ground meat, but it wasn't any meat he had ever seen before. And inside of this fleshy substance looked like little bits of bone. Now, Mike had cleared many pipes before, and he had never seen meat be the reason for a blockage. And so this whole situation just seemed really strange, and he decided, it's late, I'll just come back tomorrow with my supervisor so he can see what this is too. So Mike puts the cap back on the drain pipe, and he walks out from behind the building back out towards his truck parked on the road. And as he's walking, two of the residents of this complex come out and they say, "Hey, did you fix the blockage? What was it?" And Mike would say no, he hadn't. And then he just kind of blurted out that there was meat in the pipes. That was what was causing the blockage. And then one of these two residents says, "Well, I bet people are just flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the drains. That's what's causing it." And Mike looked at him and he was like, "Yeah, maybe." And then he just turned around, got in his truck, and he drove away. Early the next morning, Mike and his supervisor came back to Cranley Gardens, and they went around to the side of the building. They undid that cap, and then Mike reached down inside expecting to feel this blockage, but where it should have been, there was nothing. Somebody had cleared the pipes. And so Mike and his supervisor are looking at each other, and Mike is like, "There's no way that cleared on its own. Someone had to have come out here and cleared it, but I don't know why they would have done that and still had us come out." But the men decide, what, maybe by chance it did just kind of slip through and cleared itself, so let's just continue the process and make sure each of the apartment buildings, their individual pipe is unobstructed. And when they checked these pipes, they found all of them were clear except for one, apartment number 23, whose pipe was blocked up with more of this meaty substance. Mike and his partner were already very suspicious of the fact that someone had snuck out here in the middle of the night and cleared the pipe. Probably. They didn't know if that happened, but it seemed likely. And now they're finding more of this weird meat substance coming from a particular apartment. And so the whole situation just seemed off. And so they told the landlord that they were not going to touch this. Somebody else had to come out and deal with this. And the landlord, after finding out there was meat jammed in the pipes, got really freaked out and called the police. The police showed up, they pulled this meat substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary where a pathologist looked at it and said, "This is meat. It's human meat." And in particular, the stuff that was pulled out of apartment number 23's pipes is that of a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens, they go up to apartment number 23, they knock on the door, and when the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelming stench of just rotting flesh. And standing in the doorway of this apartment, the owner of the apartment, is this guy who's in his late 30s, early 40s, who introduces himself as Dennis Nielsen. And they say, "Hey, Dennis, can we have a look around your apartment?" And he says, "Why?" And they say, "Well, we found human remains in your pipes." And Dennis immediately says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's horrible." But the police are not buying it, and they say, "You know what, Dennis? Tell us where the rest of the body is." And at this, Dennis suddenly went expressionless, emotionless, and he just turns around and he points into his bedroom and he says, "It's in 2 plastic bags in my closet." And so before the police go into his apartment to go inspect these bags, they say, "Dennis, are there any other bodies in your apartment that we should know about?" And Dennis sighs and he looks up to the ceiling and says, "Yeah, there's about 15 or 16 here. It's a long story. It goes way back. I'd love to tell it to you, get this off my chest, and I'll do it at the police station." So after Dennis was arrested and brought to the station, he told them his horrible story.
It had all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33. He was at a pub having some drinks by himself when a teenager came into the bar and attempted to buy an alcoholic drink, and he was denied service. And so Dennis pulled him aside and said, "Hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's right down the road." And the young man, whose name was Steven, was very excited about this and said, "Great, let's go." Once they arrived back and they were up in Dennis's apartment, the pair had lots of drinks and they were having fun and laughing, and then at some point the pair climbed into bed together. The next morning when Dennis got up, his new friend Steven was still sleeping right next to him, and he had this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread because he knew as soon as Steven woke up, he would see this as a one-night stand and he would just leave. He would not stick around and remain friends with Dennis. And Dennis just did not like that idea. He wanted Steven to stay. And so he looked on the ground next to the bed and he saw the necktie that Steven had been wearing was on the ground. And so he got on the ground, he grabbed the necktie, he fashioned it into a noose, and then he climbed back on the bed, got on top of Steven's chest, and he looped the tie around his neck, and then he pulled it as tight as he could. And as soon as it was tight, Dennis would tell police that Steven came alive, and he began reaching for his neck and kicking Dennis as hard as he could, but he just can't get it off. And at some point, Dennis said Steven just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis and knew he wasn't going to get this off and that Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Steven just allowed himself to go limp, and then he slouched over. And as soon as that happened, Dennis said he relaxed. But as he's looking at Steven, he realized he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. And so Dennis goes into the kitchen and he gets this huge plastic bucket and he fills it up with water and he sets it in the middle of his kitchen floor. And then he gets a bunch of kitchen chairs and he lines them up like a table right in front of this bucket of water. And then he drags Steven's body into the kitchen and he lays him on his back on these chairs, but make sure his head is not resting on the chair. His head is kind of dangling off the back of these chairs. And then he grabbed that bucket of water and he slid it right underneath Steven's head. And then Dennis got on top of the chairs, on top of Steven, and then he pressed the young man's face straight down so his head went backwards until his mouth and his nose were under the water. And Dennis held him like that until Steven regained consciousness, but again, he didn't fight it. He knew he was doomed, and after several minutes, the bubbles stopped coming to the surface and Steven was dead. Dennis pulled his victim off of the chairs, he brought him into the living room, and he sat him on a chair, and then Dennis went into the kitchen and he made himself a cup of coffee, and he smoked some cigarettes, and then he just stood in the doorway and looked at Steven's body. And he would tell police it was a very bizarre experience because Steven still looked like he was alive. In fact, Dennis would try talking to him as if he was going to talk back, but obviously he didn't. And at some point, Dennis realized, the life he had before he killed Steven was now over. He had a new life and he didn't really know how to handle it. And so the first thing he thought to do was to clean Steven. So he took Steven's body and he brought him into the bathroom and he gave him a very long bath, cleaned his body, cleaned his hair, and then afterwards he got him out, he dressed him and put him into his bed, and then Dennis climbed into bed with him and laid with him. And he would tell police as he laid there, he suddenly felt overjoyed. Steven was not going to leave him. He was going to stay here as long as Dennis wanted him to. After laying with him for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Steven's body in his apartment so no one could find him. And so he left his apartment and he went to a hardware store where he got an electric knife and a big storage bin. And he brought them back to his apartment, and as he was about to cut Steven up, he just couldn't go through with it. So instead, he just climbed into bed and took a nap next to Steven's body. When he got up again, he moved Steven's body onto the ground in his living room and covered him with a blanket. And then he went and made dinner and then sat in his chair in the living room right next to this body on the ground and watched TV for a while. When he was done watching TV and eating, he looked at the body on the floor and realized, he really hadn't made any progress in terms of hiding him somewhere in his apartment. And that's when he remembered he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. And so he went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up, and he saw there was a space under the floors. And so he pulled a couple more boards up, and then he grabbed Steven's body and he attempted to force him down into this space. But by now, Steven's body had begun to stiffen up from rigor mortis. Specifically, his arms were outstretched like a Y over his head. And so as Dennis is trying to force him down in there, his arms were not allowing him to go down into that small space. So Dennis took Steven's body and he propped him up against the wall in his bedroom. So the body is against the wall, rigid, standing up with its arms up over its head, and Steven's eyes were still open. And then after that, Dennis just got in bed and fell asleep. So all night, this corpse is staring at Dennis in his bed. And then the next morning when Dennis got up,
there was Steven still up against the wall with his hands in the air looking down at him. Dennis grabbed Steven's body and put it on the ground, and he began yanking and jerking and pulling on each of Steven's arms until they were pinned down by his side. And then after that, Dennis started working on his legs and his hips, and he began contorting him until he was small enough that he could pack him down under his floor. And then once he was under there, he just put the boards on top and went about his daily life. And for the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Steven. But a week after putting him under the floor, Dennis decided he missed Steven and he wanted to see him again. And so one night he opened up the floorboards, he looked down, and there was Steven, and Dennis would say it looked like he was dirty. So he pulled him out of the floor and he gave him another bath. And then after he had cleaned Steven, he pulled him out of the water, he dried him off, and he put him in the chair. And then Dennis took a bath himself in the same water he had just used to clean Steven. After a long soak in this tub, Dennis finally got out, he toweled himself off, he redressed Steven, and then he forced him back onto the floorboards and covered him up again. And he would remain there for the next 7 months until Dennis finally decided to dispose of him by burning him in a bonfire outside of their apartment building. And then after the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking, I can't believe I just got away with murder. And so he would do it again and again and again, killing at least 15 young men from North London, all by strangulation or by drowning or a combination of the two. And after he killed them, he would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time, in his closet, in his cabinets, in his bed, under the floors, all over his apartment. He had these bodies. And while these bodies were in his apartment, he liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them. He would tell police he found corpses to be beautiful. He was fascinated by them. But eventually, in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. And so he began cutting them up and trying to force them down his drain, which eventually clogged the pipes. And so when Mike the plumber showed up and discovered this meaty substance in the pipes, and Dennis overheard him talking about it, that night after Mike was gone, Dennis had gone outside and attempted to clear the rest of the remains from the pipes. But he wasn't aware there were still remains stuck in the pipe that led to his specific apartment. Dennis Nielsen confessed to killing 15 young men and attempting to kill at least 7 others, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Dennis never showed any remorse, nor did he show any desire to want to be free again. He actually said he deserved to be in jail for what he did. In 2018, Dennis Nielsen would die in prison at the age of 72. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you got to check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are going to sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to share with you the picture that is famously associated with them. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please take 3 pigs and label them 1, 2, and 4, and release them on the like button's property. Also, subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. "66-year-old Geraldine Largay was nicknamed Inchworm by her friends for her hilariously slow hiking pace. But her slow pace didn't stop her from doing the thing that she loved, which was to hike. And in fact, on April 23rd, 2013, Geraldine, along with one of her close friends, Jane Lee, decided to embark on this nearly 1,000-mile-long hike through the Appalachian Trail. Geraldine's husband of 42 years, his name was George, he planned to drive ahead of the pair and meet them at prearranged spots along this 1,000-mile-long journey to give them supplies, and would occasionally bring them to a motel so they could shower and sleep in a bed. By June 30th, so more than 2 months after they had started this journey, Jane finds out that she has a family emergency and she isn't able to continue this hike. Geraldine decided she was going to finish what she started on her own, despite the fact that realistically she hated hiking alone. She was very scared, frankly, of being out in the wilderness by herself, but she only had about 200 miles left, and so she figured, what the heck, I'll finish this thing out on my own. Later, Jane would tell investigators that when she left the trail to handle this family emergency, she felt like Geraldine was a little bit in over her head. She was someone that just didn't do well hiking on her own, and she still had 200 miles to go. But Jane just had too much going on in her life, and so she didn't stick around to try to convince Geraldine to come with her. Instead, she said, "Best of luck, Geraldine, and I'll see you at the end." So for the next 3 weeks, Geraldine carried on down the Appalachian Trail on her own, and by all accounts, it was going really well. She was checking in with her family and saying, "This is the mile mark I'm at," and she was making all her rendezvous points with George to get resupplied and to go to the motel with him. And so everything was going great. Then on July 22nd, Geraldine would send a text message to her husband George saying that she thinks she's in some trouble and that she lost the trail and is now lost. And she would ask him to call the Appalachian Mountain Club and see if they had a trail maintainer that could come out and look for her and kind of get her back on track. The problem was Geraldine couldn't get these text messages to go through. There was very bad service where she was. So she begins to walk to higher ground to try to get a better cell phone signal. And so she goes up this hill and she repeatedly tries to send these text messages out to George to say, "I'm lost and I need help," but none of them were going through. She would spend the whole night trying to send text messages from this mountain before finally putting her sleeping bag down and sleeping for the night. The next morning, she got up and she sent another text message, this one a little bit more urgent, to her husband. She told him that she was lost since yesterday and was off the trail 3 or even 4 miles and that he should now call the police. But that message also failed. And so none of her messages over the past 24 hours have been sent out. And so nobody knows that she's lost. But at some point that day, she decides, I'm going to just put my phone away, save the battery life, and just wait, because I'm supposed to meet my husband today. And when I don't show up, he's gonna call authorities, they're gonna come looking for me, and everything will be fine. She leaves the mountain and finds this area underneath a couple of trees that had some pine needles on the ground. It was relatively soft. She set up her tent underneath these trees. She hangs a silver reflective blanket up over one of the trees to try to signal to helicopters or anybody flying overhead. She even began burning some bark to create a smoke signal, and she proceeded to wait. And sure enough, later that day, George, who's waiting at the rendezvous point for his wife, she doesn't show up, and he immediately contacts the authorities, who launch a huge search to go find Geraldine. Tragically, Geraldine was actually only about a mile, maybe 2 miles off of the trail. So she was not far from where she needed to be, but because it was so densely forested, she had no way of knowing that, and sound didn't travel very well. So over the course of the next 2 weeks, as this huge search with helicopters and planes and people on horseback and hunters and all these people in the area, they didn't find her. They might have come very close to her without knowing it, but again, because it was so densely forested, they never linked up. So on August 4th, about 2 weeks into this big search, they end up scaling it back and say, sorry, but we can't find her. The whole time this is going on, Geraldine stays at her campsite. She doesn't go anywhere. She figures, this is my best chance to survive. And she's staying very positive. She has this journal that every day she would write inside of it a daily observation, and she would also write letters to her family. All of these messages were incredibly positive. She was very much expecting to be rescued and would have this great story to tell. But as days went on and no one was finding her, you could tell in her writing that she had come to terms with the reality that she was not going to make it out of here alive. And so before she died, she wrote this beautiful message to her husband and to her daughter. When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me. No matter how many years from now, please find it in your heart to mail the contents of this bag to one of them. 2 years later, a forester would be in the area and would come across Geraldine's tent that was now crumpled and collapsed. and inside he would find Geraldine inside of her sleeping bag with the journal over her chest. And inside the tent, she'd kept it neat and clean all the way to the very end. This is someone that went out with absolute grace. Back on July 22nd, 2013, the day Geraldine would go missing, she woke up and she was all smiles and motivated to start the day. She heads off down the Appalachian Trail at about 6:30 in the morning, and she passes by another hiker who stops Geraldine, and apparently this hiker saw Geraldine's smile and said it was so infectious that she had to take a picture of her. And so Geraldine laughed and posed for this picture. After the picture was taken, the women laughed about it and then went their separate ways. And then by 11 a.m. that morning, Geraldine was lost. On August 20th, 1989, Eric and Lyle Menendez returned home to their family's mansion in Beverly Hills and knew right away something was wrong. The driveway gate was unlocked, and then they went to their front door and it was already open. They pushed the door open and cautiously walked inside and saw there was blood on the ground and looked in their TV room, and there, slouched against the couch, was their father, Jose, and their mother, Kitty. They had both been executed. Eric and Lyle are beside themselves. They call the police and they're in total hysterics, screaming for the officers to get there, that someone's killed their parents. The police show up, they go inside, and just based on the brutality of the injuries, Jose and Kitty had clearly been gunned down with shotguns and multiple blasts, because pieces of them were missing. They were just totally destroyed. The police, because of that, assumed this has got to be a mob hit. There is some real aggression here. This is not an accident. This is a statement. The police immediately turned to Jose's business. He was the CEO of this very prominent media company. He had made millions and millions of dollars. He was very well connected, and they figured that somewhere in his dealings there must have been a bad actor that was after him. And so for the first 6 months of the investigation, the focus was almost exclusively on Jose's business contacts. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric seemed to go totally crazy. They immediately inherited the $14 million family estate, and there was this huge cash payout right up front. And so the two of them go on this insane spending spree over those first 6 months. They bought condos on the water, they bought cars and Rolexes, they bought a chicken wing shop for $550,000. I mean, they were just buying things left and right. During their parents' funeral, Lyle was overheard talking about how he can't wait to go to the US Open, and look, I just bought a new Rolex. His mind was not on the fact that his parents had just been savagely murdered. It was on, what fun thing am I going to do with my money next? After the funeral, Eric decided he was going to put his energy into becoming a professional tennis player. So for $60,000, he hires a tennis player to live at his house and work with him every day on tennis, even though realistically Eric was not a very good tennis player. But that was his focus. That's what he was going to work on. And Lyle spent most of his time building a team of people that could help him make investments into different companies in and around New York and New Jersey. But in addition to spending tons of money on their respective career interests, the brothers were also going to therapy sessions. And during one particular closed-door session, Eric would tell his therapist that me and my brother actually killed our parents. Eric clearly believed that he was able to talk to a therapist about anything and nothing would escape this room, that it was totally confidential. But what Eric wasn't planning for is the therapist's assistant was outside the doors walking by and overheard Eric say it. And she would tell the police would confront Eric as well as Lyle, and very quickly Eric and Lyle would confess. During their confession, they told investigators that on August 18th, they went out and purchased 2 shotguns and they stored them in their home. The next day, on August 19th, the brothers and their mom and dad go out on a fishing trip together the whole day. They come back, and then on August 20th, the 2 brothers retrieve their shotguns while the parents are sitting in the TV room, and they walk in and fire 15 shots into their parents, obliterating them. Afterwards, the brothers would ditch their shotguns and bloody clothes, and they would go to the movie theater and they would watch Batman. After the movie was over, they go back to the mansion knowing exactly what they're going to find, and they go in and they put on this big performance of, oh my goodness, someone killed our parents! But it was all a lie, because they killed their parents for their money. Eric and Lyle were given life sentences and were sent to separate prisons, but actually just recently they were reunited in the same jail. 30 years after their crime, a guy who collected NBA trading cards was rooting through some of his older cards, and he came across the Mark Jackson 1990 card. And he noticed in the background of the picture, sitting courtside, is none other than Eric and Lyle Menendez. It was during that 6-month crazy spending spree after they had murdered their parents, when they were going around buying up whatever they wanted, and they had bought courtside tickets to that particular game, and they happened to be immortalized on this playing card. Known as the Grizzly Man, Timothy Treadwell was, above all else, a huge bear enthusiast. His passion for these creatures led to a passion for environmentalism and for documentary filmmaking, the subject of which were the grizzly bears of Katmai National Park in Alaska. And so starting in the late 1980s, Treadwell began going to Katmai National Park and setting up a camp there for the whole summer and filming all of his interactions with the grizzly bears. During the first half of the summer, Treadwell would stay in an area that he referred to as the Grizzly Sanctuary. It was this area near Hallow Bay. It was this big open green field. And all the grizzly bears seemed to just converge on this one area and kind of mosey around and be lazy. They were not aggressive at all towards Treadwell, and so he could walk up fairly close to them and just shoot great footage of these huge animals. During the second half of the summer, he would leave the Grizzly Sanctuary and go south to an area called Kaflia Bay. And it was a much more densely forested area with lots of grizzly bear trails. Treadwell could use vegetation to get right up close to some of these bears without them necessarily seeing him. He referred to this area as the Grizzly Maze. Treadwell developed a fairly bad reputation amongst the park rangers of Katmai National Park because he was pretty reckless about how he interacted with these animals. I mean, they are big, wild predators, and he would get right up close and in their personal space, and every time he was just rolling the dice because eventually they thought something bad was going to happen to him. Treadwell believed he was taking every precaution and that what he was doing was safe, but Treadwell had become very emotionally connected to the grizzly bears he was seeing at Katmai National Park. He felt so comfortable with them that he would actually walk up sometimes and pet and goof around with the bear cubs. And for whatever reason, the grizzly bear parents would not harm him. And so he felt like he was kind of one of them, and they respected him and they welcomed him into their environment. Normally, whenever Treadwell went to Alaska for the summer, he would go alone. It was just him and his camera. But at the end of the summer, in October 2003, when normally Timothy would leave Alaska, because October is the time when the grizzlies become more aggressive because they're trying to eat as much food as they can before going into hibernation, Timothy decides that instead of leaving, he's going to extend his stay one more week, and he's going to fly his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, into Alaska to spend that week with him. Friends and family did not think this was a good idea, but Timothy was like, nope, it's going to be just fine. I know these animals better than anybody else. They are not going to hurt us. So he flies Amy in, and they set up camp along a grizzly trail inside of the Grizzly Maze. Neither of them were carrying a weapon or bear repellent spray. A week later, when the pilot returned to pick up Timothy and Amy, he looked up the hill and he could clearly see their campsite was not broken down. They had not packed it up yet. They were not down at the shoreline. So he gets out of his plane and he starts walking up the hill towards their campsite, thinking maybe they lost track of time. Maybe they don't know they're getting picked up today. And as he crests the hill, he sees there is a huge grizzly bear pacing around as if guarding its prey in the middle of this campsite. The grizzly sees the pilot and makes a move as if he's going to run towards him. The pilot turns, runs back to his plane, and flies out of there. And he calls park rangers and alerts them to this grizzly bear that's in the middle of Timothy and Amy's campsite. When the park rangers finally arrived and made their way up to the campsite, they could tell right away that Timothy and Amy were deceased. Their remains were scattered all around this campsite. It was clear that a grizzly bear or more than one grizzly bear had absolutely ripped them to pieces. However, this wasn't even the most horrifying part of this discovery. As the bodies were being taken away, the park rangers began bundling up their stuff to take with them, and they found inside the tent a camera that had a 6-minute tape on it. At first, when they hit play, they thought it was a blank tape, but it wasn't. It was just inside the tent when it was recording, and so it had no visual, but then they started hearing audio. And for 6 agonizing minutes with a blank screen, they heard crystal clear audio of Timothy and Amy being eaten alive by a grizzly bear. The audio suggests that Treadwell had left their tent because they heard a bear outside and was attacked. and he starts screaming for Amy to come outside. The bear has Timothy's head in its jaws, and Timothy is screaming, "It's killing me, it's killing me." And Amy is screaming back, "Play dead." And at some point, it's clear that's not working. They have no way to fight the animal. And Timothy starts yelling for Amy to run away. She's paralyzed with fear. She's screaming at the top of her lungs. And then Timothy is groaning and screaming. And eventually it stops when he drags Timothy away. And then Amy doesn't try to run away. She's just kind of frozen in terror. And you hear the bear come back. And then her screams pick up. And then the tape goes quiet. This is the last picture of Timothy and Amy taken alive. It was taken right after Amy had landed in Alaska, and they were going to make their way up to the grizzly maze and camp out there for a few days in hopes of running into a grizzly bear. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know what you thought about them in the comments, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please take 3 pigs and label them 1, 2, and 4, and then release them on the like button's property. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen over there. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, or YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it, guys. See ya. Say hi, Henry.
Let me take him so I can see what you look like. Hi, buddy. All right, look here. All right, I guess that's good.
Great.
Oh, your hair is, it's like...
Yeah, I can't even control it now.
Your hair is getting long.
Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the photo that is famously associated with them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button asks for a phone charger, give them your broken one that only works when you bend the cord at a certain angle. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers successfully flew the world's first motor-operated airplane. By 1910, airplanes had improved to the point where they were considered a reasonable form of travel, and so people began focusing on how to make them safer. One big safety concern with airplanes at the time was there was no parachute small enough or light enough to be taken on board with passengers. And so if the plane malfunctioned and was crashing, everybody had to go down with it. So in 1911, a prominent French aviation club offered a large sum of money to anybody who could design a parachute for airplane passengers. A man named Franz Reichelt, who was a tailor in Paris, but who had always had a fascination with aviation, saw this reward in the paper and decided to take on this challenge. The design he came up with was not an external device like a backpack. Instead, it was a full suit with foldable bat wings that attached to the passenger's arms and connected all the way down to their ankles. Using his sewing know-how, he stitched up this totally bizarre-looking prototype, and he attached it to a dummy and threw it off of his apartment building. And amazingly, the dummy landed lightly on the ground. But when Franz, who significantly outweighed this dummy, put on his parachute suit and leapt off of the building himself, he did not touch the ground lightly. He smashed into the ground and broke his leg. But Franz was undeterred. He made dozens of changes to his suit, he added material, he subtracted material, and after a while, he felt like it was ready to be submitted to this French aviation club. But when the club members watched one of Franz's dummies wearing the suit come crashing into the ground because the canopy collapsed, They rejected his design. Franz assured them his design could work, they just needed to see it in action from a slightly higher altitude. The canopy needed more time to fully inflate. But the club members were not buying it, and they told Franz he should just give up on the design. Franz was offended and decided he would prove them wrong. So, in 1911, Franz began petitioning to the city of Paris to allow him to test his design off of the Eiffel Tower. He thought if he jumped from one of their platforms, that would be high enough for his canopy to fully inflate, thereby showing that his design really did work. And so for a year, the city of Paris repeatedly rejected Franz every time he asked for the chance to do this. But in 1912, something changed and the city said, okay, you know what, Franz? You can test your parachute on the Eiffel Tower. But what the city didn't know, because Franz had intentionally kept it secret from them, was he didn't intend to launch a dummy off of the Eiffel Tower wearing his suit. He was going to put the parachute suit on and jump off these 17 stories himself. And so on February 4th of that year, Franz arrived at the tower, and standing around the base of it was a throng of people and journalists who had all read about this experiment in the newspaper. And so when Franz got out and promptly put on his parachute suit, the crowd gasped. They couldn't believe he was going to be the one jumping off of the tower. And none of Franz's friends or family knew he was going to be jumping off the tower himself. And so they pleaded with him not to do this. Throw a dummy off. You should not be jumping off. This is not going to work. Legend has it, Franz turned to one of his friends and he said, "You will see that my 72 kilos and my parachute will give your arguments the most decisive of denials." Then Franz promptly turned around and began walking up the stairs towards the platform. And with him was a journalist who brought a camera. Once Franz reached the platform, the journalist began filming him, and his video would capture Franz climbing up onto the railing and then hesitating. And he anxiously begins kind of rocking back and forth like he's debating whether he's really going to do this. And then at some point, he works up the courage and he jumps. And immediately his suit collapses and he slams into the ground, dying instantly. Another cameraman was on the ground and he filmed Franz's final jump. Here is a still shot of Franz right before impact. 45-year-old Florida man Mike Moylan suddenly shot up in bed and grabbed the sides of his head, wincing in pain. He had a blinding headache. He squinted across the room at the alarm clock. It was 4:30 in the morning on June 28, 2007. Mike got out of bed and tried to stand up, but he immediately got dizzy, so he sat back down again, took a couple of deep breaths, and then he stood up again, and this time he was steady on his feet. He walked across his bedroom into his bathroom where he opened the medicine cabinet, grabbed some painkillers, swallowed 3 of them, and then walked back into his bedroom. Before he lay down again, he noticed there was a dark spot on his pillow. Now, it was dark in his room, so he couldn't really tell what it was, and his wife April was fast asleep in bed with him, so he didn't want to flip the lights on and wake her up, but he had a feeling that that spot was likely blood. And so he ran his hands all over his head to see if there was blood coming off of him, and he found some on his right ear. And so he thought to himself, well, I guess my wife must have elbowed me in my sleep, that's why I'm bleeding, and that's why my head hurts. And so feeling content that that was what happened, he laid back down and waited for the meds to kick in so he could sleep. But after 30 minutes of complete restlessness, not only had the meds done nothing, it seemed like his headache was getting progressively worse and his ear continued to bleed. And suddenly Mike thought to himself, wait a minute, what if I have an aneurysm that's burst, and that's why there's blood leaking out of my ear onto the pillow? A brain aneurysm is the bulging or ballooning of a blood vessel in the brain, and if it ruptures, it can be fatal. And so now, feeling scared that he was dying, Mike woke up his wife April and told her, we gotta go to the hospital right away. And April, who's half asleep, seemed very confused, but eventually got the message, and they got up, they hopped in her car, and she drove them to the emergency room. As soon as they got there, doctors x-rayed Mike's head. Afterwards, when Mike and April were sitting in an exam room, a nurse walked in holding onto an x-ray image, and she held it up to the light and she pointed to a foreign object in Mike's skull, and she says, well, it looks like you got shot. Mike couldn't believe it. And neither could the nurse or any of the doctors. He should have been dead. April, who was apparently so overcome with emotions, ran out of the room, and Mike was quickly ushered into emergency surgery, where after a couple of hours, they were able to remove the bullet from his head. As Mike lay in his hospital bed recovering from the surgery with his wife next to him, the police showed up and began asking questions about what happened. And they initially just believed that a stray bullet must have entered the home and struck Mike in the side of his head. But after speaking to the couple, April revealed that she slept with a pistol underneath her pillow and that maybe it had fired accidentally. And then when they really dug into this and they asked her more questions about this gun underneath her pillow, her story began to unravel, and eventually she would confess that she had in fact tried to kill Mike and shot him while he was sleeping. She told police the reason she did it is she had recently destroyed one of the couple's successful businesses, but Mike had not found out about it yet. And so she decided she would kill him before he could find out. After her confession, Mike was crushed and felt like an idiot, but he would tell police that there were a couple of red flags about his wife that he noticed on the night he actually woke up with this headache. For one, when he told her, hey, I want to go to the hospital because I'm bleeding out of my ear, she apparently took a really long time getting dressed and acted overly confused about what was happening, well beyond the I'm just tired routine. And then when they got in the car and were driving to the hospital, she was driving impossibly slow and he was asking her to speed up and she just wouldn't. And so Mike realized now that what she was really doing was hoping if she just delayed long enough, he might die before they reached the hospital. Obviously, he did not. April was jailed on attempted murder charges, but just a year after being in prison, she was released on a plea deal. Here is the image of Mike's x-ray where they discovered he had a bullet in his head. One of the most insane jobs in the world is being a saturation diver for an oil and gas company. These highly specialized divers go down to extreme depths to do construction and demolition on underwater structures. The extreme pressure on their bodies from being so deep will cause some of the mixed gas they breathe to get trapped inside of their body. Now, this is harmless while it's happening, so while they're down at depth, this doesn't matter. But when they ascend, they have to do what's called decompression stops, where they basically stop in the water column at certain depths and just wait and allow these trapped gases to naturally come out of their body. Now, if they skip these decompression stops and just rush to the surface, those trapped gases will not leave their body and they will expand inside of them, causing a condition called decompression sickness or the bends, and it can be fatal. Now, these decompression stops get longer and longer the deeper you go. And in the case of saturation divers, they'll go as deep as 2,000 feet. And for reference, in order to safely ascend from 2,000 feet, it would take you about 33 hours. And so these oil and gas companies can't afford to have their divers taking 33 hours in between dives, and so they came up with a clever workaround. They built a pressurized chamber system on board ships and oil rigs where their divers would live in between their dives. And what this did was, by keeping their divers constantly under pressure, either literally underwater or in this system, the trapped gases inside of them didn't have a chance to expand, and so their divers couldn't get the bends. The divers would live inside of this incredibly cramped chamber for weeks at a time, getting transported to and from the seafloor inside of this small pressurized sphere that's called a dive bell that could detach from the chamber without totally depressurizing the whole system. At the end of these divers' multi-week shifts, they would do one long decompression stop inside of the chamber. And then when they were done, they'd step out of the chamber and they'd be fine again. In September of 2012, a 32-year-old saturation diver named Chris Lemons was on board a dive ship in the middle of the North Sea. He, along with 11 other divers, had just started a 4-week-long saturation shift. On the 12th of that month, Chris, along with 2 other divers named Dave and Duncan, were scheduled to perform routine maintenance on an oil platform 330 feet below the surface. The North Sea is notorious for terrible weather, but this day the weather was especially bad, and they considered not doing the dive, but ultimately they decided to do it anyways. As Chris, Dave, and Duncan put on their diving equipment and climbed from their living chamber through the tunnel into the dive bell, the captain of the ship navigated directly over this oil platform and then flipped on autopilot mode, which activated dynamic positioning. Now, dive ships rely heavily on dynamic positioning, which is really just this high-tech computer that makes sure as soon as you turn it on that the ship does not move from a particular spot in the water. So regardless of the swells and the wind, the ship stays steady. And this is really important when you have divers in the water because the dive bell is connected to the ship and the divers are connected to the dive bell. And so if the ship is moving all over the place, so is the dive bell, and so are the divers, making it impossible for the divers to do their job. Once the captain had the dynamic positioning up and running, the 3 divers sealed the door of the dive bell behind them, and then the dive bell was detached from the chamber and then lowered through a hole in the middle of the ship into the ocean. Once the bell got down to 330 feet, Chris opened up a hatch on the bottom of the dive bell that led directly into the water. Now, because the pressure inside the bell matches the pressure outside the bell, water does not come in through this hole. Duncan was the bellman for the night, so he would not be going out and doing any diving. He would be staying in the bell to support Dave and Chris. And so he helped them get their big helmets on and connected their umbilical to each of them. Sat divers, when they're outside of the bell, are completely reliant on their umbilical. It's this long stretch of tubes and wires that are connected directly to their suit and to their helmet, and it provides air as well as heat and electricity to their lights, and it provides radio communication up to the people on the boat. Once Chris and Dave were all set up, they slipped through the hole at the bottom of the bell, which brought them down to this little platform that was suspended right below the bell, and from there they leapt off all the way down to the sea floor. Now, sat divers will say that leap from that platform is both amazing and terrifying, because once you leave the bell, it's completely pitch black all around you, so there's no reference point of how fast you're going or even how close to the ground you are. And so it feels like you're just sinking into this endless abyss before you crash into the ground. Once Chris and Dave did hit the ground, they stood up and began walking, and they were directed by the radio in their helmet which direction they needed to go to reach this oil platform. The oil platform was 11 meters tall, and it looked like a sort of pyramid of these big steel pipes. They climbed up the side until they reached their respective working area, and then they settled in to do their job, which they expected to take about 6 hours. At first, everything was going to plan, but about an hour into the job, something went terribly wrong on the surface. The dynamic positioning computer failed. Now, the captain immediately saw it and just expected the backup computer to kick in and take over. But in a terrible turn of luck, the backup computer also failed. And so very quickly, this huge dive ship began drifting in the rough seas, dragging with it the dive bell and the divers 330 feet below. While the captain struggled to try to fix the system and get it back online and get the ship back on station, another crew member hopped on the radio and called down to Dave and Chris, who were outside of the dive bell, and told them to abandon the structure and get back in the bell ASAP. And Chris and Dave could tell from the urgency in this person's voice that this was no drill. This was serious. Chris and Dave were both positioned on the south side of the structure about halfway up, and their umbilicals were running straight up the structure and then northward because the ship was drifting northward. So neither Chris nor Dave could go around the structure. They needed to go straight up before being able to climb their umbilicals back up to the bell. And so both men began climbing, but they could feel the tension on their umbilical was getting tighter and tighter, and Dave managed to get all the way to the top, and he cleared the lip, and as soon as he was on top, he started getting pulled away from the structure. And he looked to see if Chris was also getting pulled, and all he saw was Chris's umbilical, impossibly stretched, still draped over the south side, and he could not see Chris. And that's when Dave, Duncan, and all the people on the surface heard Chris come over the radio frantically saying he was stuck on the underwater structure. His umbilical had gotten wrapped around one of the pylons. And so through the radio, Chris asked Duncan to give him more slack. But Duncan said, "There is no more slack. We are completely tight here. You have to get it free." And Chris would say, "I can't unfree it. It keeps getting tighter and tighter. I can't get it off the pylon." And so Dave jumped down onto the platform and tried to pull himself over to Chris, but his own umbilical was getting pulled towards the dive bell, and so he could not help Chris. And so Dave knew he couldn't do anything, so he turned and began crawling up his umbilical towards the dive bell, and as he's climbing, he hears behind him this extremely loud explosion. It sounded like a shotgun going off. And what it was Chris's umbilical snapping under the tension. As soon as the umbilical snapped, it sent Chris flying backwards off the structure, falling towards the ocean floor. Without his umbilical, he wouldn't have had light, he wouldn't have had a radio to talk to anybody up on the boat, he wouldn't have had heat, and the water was just barely above freezing, and so he would have been very cold very fast, and he would not have had an air supply. Although he would have had 2 backup canisters on his back that would automatically turn on. However, they only gave him 5 or maybe 6 minutes of air. And so when Chris hit the ocean floor, it would have been eerily quiet and totally, completely pitch black. He stood up at some point and looked around him and didn't see anything, but knew he had to get back to the underwater structure. It was his only chance of anybody finding him again. And so he had to make the impossible decision of just choosing a direction and blindly walking, not having any idea what you're walking towards. Choose wrong and you might walk over a cliff. But at some point, Chris made up his mind and just began walking in a single direction, and miraculously, he walked into the underwater structure. He climbed up the side until he got to the top, which was a flat metal grate, and there he looked around and saw there was no dive bell, there was no sign of anything. It was just him. He was completely all alone. And he must have known at this point that he was running out of air. He probably had maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. And so he would have been acutely aware that even if they're looking for him, they're not going to find him in time. He's going to die. And at some point, breathing would have become extremely difficult until there was no more air, and then he would have passed out and keeled over. Back on the surface, the captain was desperately trying to use manual controls to pilot the ship back over where Chris was, but because of how rough the seas were, it was proving to be nearly impossible. As the captain struggled, other members of the crew launched a remote-controlled vehicle into the water to at least go down and try to find Chris. And so they decided they would just pilot straight to the underwater structure and begin looking around that area. And so for a few anxious minutes, the crew on board the ship watched the camera, which was the live feed coming from this underwater vehicle, as it went through totally dark water. And then at some point on the screen, the structure just appeared, and the vehicle, as it went up towards the top, it got a look at the very top of the structure. And on the screen, they saw Chris lying on his side, totally motionless. At this point, he had been without air for at least 20 minutes. In a last-ditch effort, the captain decided to completely power off the ship and its computer and just do a hard reset, something that you would never do, especially in rough seas, because if it doesn't come back on again, you are dead in the water. But when they turned it back on again, the ship came on and the computer system came back online, including the dynamic positioning computer. And so the captain immediately threw it on autopilot and the ship navigated right over where Chris's last position was. After Chris's umbilical had broken, Dave had managed to climb back up to the bell, and he was just standing underneath that platform right beneath it. And so when the ship got right back over Chris's position, Dave leapt off the platform, got to the seafloor, climbed up the structure, grabbed hold of Chris's body, and hauled him back up into the bell. Once Chris's body was inside the bell, Duncan, the bellman, removed Chris's helmet, and he saw that his face was blue and he was totally lifeless. But Duncan immediately just gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And after giving him 2 big breaths, Chris came back to life. He started gagging and coughing, and he's looking around wide-eyed, and Duncan and Dave are looking at him like, you gotta be kidding me, you're supposed to be dead. And after about 30 seconds, the color in Chris's face had totally come back, and he was looking at Duncan and Dave and asked them, what happened? And Duncan and Dave didn't have an answer for him. And so instead, all 3 men just started laughing and hugging. They could not believe it. Once Chris was brought back up to the ship, the dive medic looked at him and concluded that nothing was wrong with him. He was perfectly fine, despite the fact he had been without an air supply for over 30 minutes. And 3 weeks after the incident, Chris was back down saturation diving again. Today, scientists don't know how Chris survived. The leading theory is that it was just so cold, it slowed his heart and his brain down, and that somehow kept him alive. But the reality is, his survival is a total mystery. Here is what the crew saw when their remote-controlled vehicle found Chris lying on top of that platform. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button asks for a phone charger, give them your broken one that only works when you bend the cord at a certain angle. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's video is brought to you by SimpliSafe. Today, we're going to look at 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the photo or photos that are famously associated with them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 1 or 2 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to give the like button a massage, but apply too little pressure so the experience is unsatisfactory. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On August 15th, 2003, 41-year-old veteran construction worker Ron Hunt was part of a crew that was building a house in Reno, Nevada. On that particular day, Ron knew before he could do anything else on the job site, the first thing he needed to do was drill a couple of large holes in the ceiling of one of the rooms in this house. And so as soon as he got to the job site that morning, he went in the back of his truck and pulled out a 6-foot-tall stepladder and a drill, and then walked into that particular room. Once inside, he opened up a stepladder and placed it where he wanted it, and then he tested his drill by squeezing the trigger a couple of times. And so once he knew that worked, he climbed up the ladder a couple of steps, not to the very top, but just a couple of steps, and began punching holes in the ceiling with this drill. Now, at first, these holes were very easy to punch through, but when he got down and moved the ladder to another section of this room where he also needed holes in the ceiling, when he got up there, he could not get the drill to go through the ceiling. And he didn't really get it because he knew there was nothing behind the ceiling that would stop the drill from going through, and it was just wood, so it really should be going through. And so he decided he just needed a little bit of extra leverage. He needed to really press on the back of this drill while he's pulling the trigger. And so instead of standing on the second or third rung of the 6-foot-tall stepladder, he walked to the very top of the ladder, the kind of dangerous section you're not supposed to stand on any ladder. And from there, he was in a better position to really push this drill into the ceiling. And so he gets in position and kind of feels like the ladder's fairly stable. And then he lines up this drill where he wants it. He begins squeezing the trigger. And at the same time, he really pushes with all that extra leverage into the ceiling. And as he does that, he feels the drill starting to go into the wood. But at the same time, he's pushing so hard that he's not realizing he's pushing down with his feet at a bit of an angle. And at some point, he pushes too hard and he causes the ladder to spill out from underneath him. Ron instinctively tried to throw the drill away from him, which is a common practice amongst construction workers. You don't want to land on your gear, it could hurt you. But he wasn't able to throw the drill far enough away from him. And even worse, the drill, when it hit the ground, basically right underneath him, it landed on its back with the drill bit pointing straight up into the air. And so when he fell down face first, his right eye socket landed directly on the drill. And so this 18-inch long, 1.5-inch in diameter drill bit impales his head, goes right through his eyeball, goes through his skull, and punctures out the back of his head. And so Ron, he hits the ground, but he's conscious. And so without even rolling over, he just reaches up with his hands and he feels the base of this drill, and then he traces to the drill bit and he feels it going into his eye, and then he feels around the back of his head and he feels the rest of the drill coming out of his skull. And at that point, he just starts screaming. The only other worker on the job site at the time was this man named Forrest, and Forrest, who was in a separate part of the job site, he hears Ron screaming, and so he runs over, he goes in the room, and he sees Ron, who's now standing up, cradling the drill base. The bit, the 18-inch bit, is still poking through his head, and so Ron is looking at Forrest and then turns to the side to show him that he's been fully impaled by this thing, and Forrest is totally horrified at what he's seeing. He can't believe Ron is even alive, but then Forrest jumps into action. He rips his shirt off, runs over to Ron, and kind of wraps it around his head to try to control the bleeding a little bit, and then he tells Ron to stay where he is, and then Forrest ran out of the job site, ran about 1,000 feet away to the nearest house, and he was able to use their phone to call paramedics. The paramedics arrive in an ambulance a few minutes later, and they find Ron sitting next to Forrest, just with this drill still in his face. Ron is very obviously in shock because he's not making any sound. He's totally conscious, but he's just kind of staring blankly, holding on to this thing. And so the paramedics, they go over and they detach the drill base from the drill bit. So all that's left is the actual 18-inch rod that's been pushed through his head. And then they take Ron via ambulance to a local hospital. And from there, they actually fly him in a helicopter to a bigger hospital that can handle this kind of injury. And so when he arrives at this larger hospital, they rush him immediately to the operating room. And at first, the surgeons attempted to cut off either end of this bit, the part that's sticking out the front of his eye and the part that's sticking out the back of his head. But they realized once they did that, there would still be this huge piece of bit that was stuck in his skull, and that would obviously be a huge problem. And so after thinking about it, they decided their best bet was just to unscrew the bit from his head. And so they gave him some morphine, and then over the next couple of hours, the doctors slowly twisted this piece of metal until it finally unwound itself out of his skull. And apparently, as they were doing that, Ron, who was so high on painkillers, was cracking jokes about how somebody needs to come in here and take a picture of me. I probably look so great. And so miraculously, Ron would survive, and he would not even be paralyzed. The worst thing that happened to him is he lost the sight in his right eye. But all things considered, Ron is okay with that. The surgeons would tell Ron that the only reason he didn't die or get paralyzed is because when that drill bit went into his skull, it kind of pressed his brain aside as it passed through. Had it punctured his brain when it went through, that almost certainly would have killed him, but by some unbelievably slim chance, it did not, and he survived. Here is Ron's X-ray. Before we get into the next story, I want to talk about today's sponsor. Ever since I started this channel, I have been shocked at the number of home invasion stories I've come across where the victims locked their doors and lived in a safe neighborhood. And so for this reason, I went out and got SimpliSafe. SimpliSafe is an incredibly effective and easy to use home security system. And honestly, for me, a big selling point was they don't send a company to your house to set it all up. I hate that. It's totally an inconvenience. And usually you don't even know how to use the system at the end of it. So instead, they send you this really neatly packaged small kit, and then using their very easy to navigate app, you build the system yourself. And so for reference, it took me less than an hour to do this, and everything worked first try. So it's very, very easy to use. Also, SimpliSafe will fit any home. It's fully customizable. They have all the cameras and sensors for every type of door and window, and they have lots of cool extra stuff like water sensors, temperature sensors, smart locks for doors, and they even have this really cool outdoor camera that has a massive field of vision. It's got 8x zoom, it's got night vision, and so basically at any hour of the day, you can know what's going on outside and inside your home. And SimpliSafe professionally monitors your system all the time. So if anything were to happen, they would call the authorities. So if you want to feel safe like me and my family, then go to simplisafe.com/MrBallen. If you sign up with that link, you can get at least 30% off when you get your SimpliSafe system. All right, back to the stories. In 2009, 15-year-old Christina Grimmie finally caved and made her own YouTube channel. For years, her friends and family had been begging her to do this because Christina had this incredible singing voice that they wanted the world to hear, but Christina had always been hesitant because she was a bit of an introvert. But that year, Christina was feeling more outgoing, and so she took the plunge, she makes this channel, and in July of that year, she uploads her first 2 songs. They were both cover songs, and she was really proud of them, but when she uploaded them, they didn't get very many views. And so Christina probably was not very excited about making more videos. But a month later, she found herself really enjoying the song Party in the USA by Miley Cyrus. And so she was singing it all the time and humming it all the time. And so finally she said, okay, I'll just film myself covering that song. And so she records herself singing this song. She uploads it to her YouTube channel, her 3rd video, and she thinks no one's going to see it because her first 2 videos no one really saw. But this video is different. It went viral almost immediately, and millions of people saw it, and they loved it. Christina couldn't believe it, even though her friends and family had been telling her all along, you have this great voice, you got to share it with the world. That's different than actually seeing the results of the world saying, you're really great, we love your voice. And so she saw this huge opportunity, and she began uploading more and more music to her channel, and more of her videos went viral. Over the next 4 years, she amassed over 2 million subscribers on her YouTube channel. She put out her own album, and she even went on tour with the mega celebrity pop star Selena Gomez. In 2014, Christina auditioned for the TV singing competition called The Voice. This show only allows a very small number of contestants who are all incredibly talented musicians. They get screened really aggressively before the competition even starts. But despite the very intense competition she was up against, Christina still managed to finish 3rd overall in this competition. Now, she might have been a little bit let down that she didn't finish 1st, but that show did wonders for her career because the judges of this competition were mega celebrity musicians, And every time Christina was on TV doing her performance for the competition, the judges would be raving about how talented she was, and that even if she doesn't win this competition, someone's going to sign her. She's so incredible. And then sure enough, shortly after that competition ended, Christina was signed to a major record label. But despite being considered a star by the masses, Christina still very much viewed herself as being a YouTuber first, which meant despite her mainstream popularity and fame, she continued to upload songs and vlogs to her YouTube channel because she wanted to stay connected to her fans. YouTubers often upload videos that appear very amateur, like not professionally produced. It almost looks like anybody could have picked up their phone and filmed that video. And YouTubers tend to be very candid and show their personality in their videos. And so it makes YouTubers, especially these really popular ones, seem very real and raw and relatable. Unlike traditional celebrities that are kind of outside of society, living in their mansions, living a totally elite and different lifestyle. YouTubers feel like they're your friends. And this was definitely the case with Christina. On her videos, she came off as very humble and gracious and kind and friendly, and so her fans truly adored her. By June of 2016, Christina was still growing in popularity when she was asked to be the opening act for this concert in Orlando, Florida that was happening later that month. She agreed, and then on the day of the concert, which was June 10th, she posted to her social media this kind of shout out to all of her fans saying, hey, if you're in the Orlando, Florida area, come out to my show. And then after the show, I'm going to stick around and sign autographs and meet you guys. That night, the venue where this concert was happening was jam-packed, and most of the people were there for Christina, not the main act. And so Christina, she goes on stage, she has this incredible performance, the main act goes on stage, and then around 10 p.m., the concert ends, at which point Christina comes back out from behind stage and went right out into the crowd and began meeting her fans and hugging them and signing autographs and taking pictures. And then at 10:24 p.m., a man who was a fan of Christina's walked down from the back of the venue and kind of awkwardly gestured that he kind of wanted to get a hug. And Christina saw that, and so she smiled and she walked up to him. She opened her arms to give him a big hug. And when she got just a couple of feet away from him, he drew a pistol and he fired 4 shots into her head and into her body. Christina's brother, Mark, he was standing right nearby and he saw the attack. And so he tackled the shooter and he was trying to get control of this guy. But at some point, the shooter managed to wriggle free, and then he stood up and he kind of walked backwards until he was literally up against this wall looking at the sea of people that are totally horrified. People are screaming and running and no one knows what he's going to do next. And then the shooter just raises the gun, puts it to his head, and pulls the trigger. There were people in the audience who were medically trained who rushed over to Christina and they began performing CPR on her, but there really wasn't anything anyone could do. She would die that night at the hospital. Her killer was a 27-year-old man named Kevin Loibel. He, like many people, had become a Christina superfan, but his infatuation with her became a totally unhealthy obsession. And when it eventually dawned on him that he most likely would never have a romantic relationship with Christina, he came to the conclusion that if I can't have her, no one can have her. And so when Christina put that post out on social media asking people to come to Orlando to see her show and meet her after the show, he took that as an opportunity to go kill her. And so he lived in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is 120 miles away. And so he sees this post on social media. He grabs his 2 pistols, some extra ammunition. He gets a large hunting knife, and then he calls a cab. The cab drives him 120 miles northeast to Orlando, Florida. And then he gets into the venue with his weaponry because there weren't metal detectors and no one was frisking people as they came inside. And so he was in the back of the venue during the show. And then when it was over, he kind of lingered back, allowing other fans to go up and, kind of mob Christina. And then when there was a lull and there were less people down there with her, he strode right down the aisle and he ended her life. Here is a photo of Kevin standing in the back of this venue just moments before the show came to an end. In 2019, 21-year-old Samantha Josephson was a senior at the University of South Carolina. She was a brilliant student who aspired to be a lawyer. Specifically, she wanted to practice international law. And so in order to do that, she needed to be able to speak other languages besides English. And so during her college years, she had really leaned into Spanish and become quite good at it rather quickly. During her college Spanish studies, one of her professors was a woman named Daniela Jaimes. Daniela very quickly recognized in Samantha that she had this incredible intellect and work ethic and just knew she was destined for greatness. In fact, she compared Samantha to Amal Clooney, who is George Clooney's wife and is considered to be one of the most famous international lawyers ever. And so just out of a general interest to see Samantha succeed, Daniela offered to Samantha to kind of be there for her if she needed anything beyond just Spanish, that she was there to help her with law school applications, or if she needed advice on something, or if she just had ideas she wanted to bounce off of her, she would be available. And Samantha had taken her up on this offer, and by 2019, in Samantha's senior year, the pair had become very close, forming a sort of mentor-mentee relationship. Early that year, Samantha got accepted into her target law school, Drexel University in Pennsylvania. And so after telling her mother and father, Samantha ran to Daniela's office to tell her mentor the great news. And the two hugged and laughed and celebrated right there in the office. It was clear that everything was falling into place for Samantha, and Daniela was just very, very proud of her. A few weeks later, on March 29th, Samantha decided to go out with her friends for some drinks. Now, Samantha normally spent a lot of her time studying, even on the weekends, but since she was about a month away from graduation and she was already accepted to law school and really didn't have that much work since it was the end of the year anyways, she decided she could cut loose for that weekend. So she, along with her friends, head out to this downtown area called 5 Points, which is right near the University of South Carolina, and it's an area that's full of shops and restaurants and bars, so on the weekends it is packed with college students. Samantha and her friends hop from bar to bar, they're having a great time, and then around 2 a.m. the group found themselves in a bar called Bird Dog, and while they were there, because it was so crowded, the group of friends got separated. Now, initially the friends were trying to reconnect with each other through texts and phone calls, but they were just really struggling to locate each other, and kind of in the middle of all that, Samantha decided that she was just too tired and didn't really feel like staying out any longer, and so she texted her friends and let them know that she was going to head back to her room. So Samantha leaves the Bird Dog bar on her own, she hops in an Uber, and she starts driving back towards her campus. Several hours later, after all of Samantha's friends had also finally gone home and then woke up that following morning, they realized Samantha was not in her room, and so they called her, she didn't pick up, they started asking around to other friends who might know where she was, but no one did. And so pretty quickly, Samantha's friends were very, very worried about her because the last they had seen her, she was leaving the bar on her own. And so they were really worried something might have happened to her. And so by 1:30 p.m. that day, on that Saturday, the day after they had gone out, they called the police and reported her missing. At the same time that Samantha was reported missing, there were these two men who were in their mid-20s that were located 70 miles to the east of the University of South Carolina. They were out in this forest and they were hunting for turkeys. Earlier that day, these two men, whose names were Anders and Ryan, they had had no luck actually finding these birds, and so they were getting frustrated. And so by the afternoon, they had split up and were kind of combing this forest on their own to see if they would have more luck solo. And so Ryan, he posted up next to their truck, which was parked on this dirt road that was butted up against the edge of this big forest. And Ryan, with his binoculars, was scanning out across this field that butted up against the tree line of the forest, and he was kind of scanning the tree line, but he still was having no luck finding any turkeys. And then Anders, he actually had walked into that forest, which was right next to Ryan, and he was just kind of walking around looking for the birds as well, but he too was still having no luck. And so around 4:30 p.m., Anders, who's the one in the forest, he finally is just ready to admit defeat and leave empty-handed. And so he turns around and begins walking out of the forest in the direction of Ryan. And so at this point, he's maybe 100 or 200 feet away from Ryan, but the trees are very thick and they can't really see each other. And so Anders is just kind of walking in that direction. He's not looking for birds anymore, so he's not scouting around. He's just kind of looking straight ahead. And as he's walking, something catches his eye off to the left behind some trees. It was pretty far away, but he instinctively turned and looked, and he couldn't really tell what it was. It wasn't a turkey, but it wasn't anything that should have been in the forest. And so he decided he would go get a better look. And so he turned away from Ryan and went left and started cutting through the trees. And he kept walking until his view of this thing was no longer obscured by trees. And when he got a full look at this thing that had caught his attention, he stopped where he was. He yelled for Ryan, who couldn't see him, but he yelled for him to come into the woods and look at this. And as Ryan is running into the forest to see what's going on, Anders is pulling his phone out and calling the police. When the police finally show up, they find Anders and Ryan, and they're very shaken up, and they're sitting on the back of their truck on that dirt road where Ryan had been. And so the police pull up to them, they speak to them and get directions of how to get to what they saw inside of the forest. And then the police officers walk into the forest, they follow the directions, and before long, they're looking down at Samantha. 14 hours before her body was discovered, Samantha left the Bird Dog Bar and walked out front where there's lots of other students, and she walked to this corner of this road right in front of her, and she hailed an Uber. And then the Uber car pulls up, she hops inside, and then the car backs up and drives away. Except that was not an Uber car. That was a car driven by a 24-year-old named Nathaniel Rowland, who was not an Uber driver. He was a guy who had been driving around 5 Points all night, presumably to try to trick people into getting into his vehicle, believing it was an Uber. And finally, his plan had worked. He had pulled in right in front of Samantha. She thought it was her car. She climbed in without question. And then once she was inside, she couldn't get out again because the doors were child locked. There was no way to open them unless they were opened from the outside. Now, initially, Samantha wouldn't have noticed this. She just sat in the back seat. The car backed up. It started driving, except it didn't drive towards her campus. It drove the opposite direction. And the drive from this bar to the campus was only a couple of minutes long. And so even if she wasn't really paying attention, she would have recognized fairly quickly they were going the wrong way, because again, she's expecting to get dropped off within a couple of minutes. Now, we don't know what actually happened inside that car in terms of how Samantha actually handled this realization that he was taking her the wrong way. We don't know if she confronted him. We don't know if she tried to open the door and then realized it was child locked. We just don't know. All we know is that Nathaniel drove Samantha to some isolated area, most likely 70 miles to the east, near that forested area where her body was found. And then once he parked wherever he was, Nathaniel pulled out a knife and then leapt into the back seat of his car where Samantha was trapped, and he stabbed her 120 times. And then after he was finished stabbing her, it would take Samantha over 10 minutes to finally die. Within hours of dumping her body in the forest, Nathaniel was posting these normal posts on Facebook of him in front of his car and regular status updates, and he was having very normal interactions with his family and his friends, as if he was completely unaffected by this horrible crime he had just committed. Nathaniel was arrested within 24 hours of the discovery of Samantha's body. While he never offered any motive for the crime, it's believed he simply decided that night he was going to go kill someone. And so he just began prowling around for a victim, and unfortunately, Samantha was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nathaniel was ultimately convicted of her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Here are the final images of Samantha as she climbs into Nathaniel's car. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to give the like button a massage, but apply too little pressure so the experience is unsatisfactory. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is Shop Mr. Ballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just Mr. Ballen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also Mr. Ballen. We also have a second YouTube channel just called Mr. Ballen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page called Mr. Ballen where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.